Imagine being somewhere so remote that there is no quick way out. No streetlights, no cell service, no nearby house, no passing cars, just trees, water, mountains, and miles of empty country in every direction. Now imagine that while you're out there, you hear something calling to you. At first it sounds normal. Maybe it sounds like a cow bawling somewhere beyond the fence line. Maybe it sounds like a friend whispering from the edge of the lake. Maybe it even sounds like someone you know, someone you trust, saying they need help. But then something about it is wrong. The voice is too close, or it moves too fast, or it calls from two places at once. And suddenly, you understand that whatever is out there is not lost, and it is not asking for help. It is trying to get you to answer. Tonight, we have two Skinwalker horror stories from two very different wildernesses. One takes place on a lonely cattle allotment near the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, where an experienced ranch hand finds out that some boundaries exist for a reason. The other takes place in the boundary waters of Minnesota, where four friends follow the wrong canoe into a nightmare that knows their voices better than they do. So turn off the lights, settle in, and whatever you hear outside while this video is playing, don't answer it. But before we get into those stories, if you enjoy scary stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We upload new episodes every week, and if you like listening on the go or for sleep, you can also find the Just Creepy podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. Leaving a rating or review helps grow the show. Now, let's get into it. I've worked cattle most of my life, and I'm not going to pretend I understand everything I've seen out there. A man who spends 40 years on horseback learns the country talks to him in its own way, and most of what it says is plain enough. Weather coming, water gone bad, a lion working a draw. You learn to read it the same way you read a man's face across a table, and after a while you trust that reading more than you trust your own two eyes. Because the eyes can be fooled and the patterns can't. That's what I want you to understand before I tell you the rest of it. I wasn't a green kid out there. I knew what I was looking at most days. The summer I'm going to tell you about is the one where that stopped being true, and I've never been able to make it true again. The outfit I rode for ran cattle on a forest grazing allotment, up against the Gila Wilderness boundary in southwest New Mexico, north and west of a little nothing town called Mimbres. If you've never been out that way, I'll tell you it's some of the emptiest big country left in the lower part of the United States. The Gila's the first piece of ground anybody ever set aside as wilderness in this country, back in 1924, and they meant it. No roads to speak of past a certain point. No motors of any kind allowed across the line. Just mountains stacked on mountains, juniper and pinon down low, ponderosa up high, and canyons that'll swallow a day's ride before you found the bottom. The allotment I worked was a few thousand acres of permitted range that bumped right up against that boundary, and the fence between the two was an old 4-strand barbed wire affair that had been there longer than I had. That fence is going to matter, so hold on to it. I'd been on that outfit 11 years by the summer this happened. I was past 60 by then, riding for a man named Harlan, who'd inherited the permit and the cattle from his father and didn't much care for either, which suited me fine because it meant he left me alone to run things the way I knew how. I lived most of the grazing season in a line camp up near the high pasture, an old log cabin with a wood stove and a spring box and not much else. There was no electricity up there and no telephone, but I kept a battery two-way radio in the cabin, the kind that runs off a dry cell pack, and I'd check in with Harlan on it every so often, and could raise a couple of the neighbors on it if I had to. And that was the one thread of talk I had to the outside world from that camp. I'd ride down to the headquarters in person, maybe once every couple weeks for supplies, and to tell Harlan everything was fine. That summer it wasn't fine, but it took me a long while to say so, because the things that were wrong didn't add up to anything a sane man could put in words. I want to give you a sense of how a day went up there before any of it started, because you can't understand how wrong it got unless you understand how ordinary it was supposed to be. I'd be up before the sun most mornings, because that's the habit of a lifetime, and there's no breaking it past a certain age. I'd build up the stove and put coffee on and stand in the door of that cabin with a cup of it and watch the light come into the meadow. And you could see the cattle from there, the near bunch of them down in the low end of the park where the grass was good and the spring ran. I'd watch them a while to see how they were laying and how they were grazing, because cattle tell you things in the morning if you watch them, and then I'd go catch up whichever horse I meant to ride that day. I kept 4 head of horses up at that camp, in a little trap behind the cabin, and I'd rotate through them so none of them got worn too hard, because there isn't a vehicle made that does you any good in that country, and a man on that allotment is only as good as the horses under him. I'd grain whichever one I'd caught, and saddle, and by full light I'd be horseback, and headed out to whatever the day called for, and the days called for plenty. A grazing allotment that size isn't a thing you just turn cattle loose on and forget. There's fence, miles and miles of it. The wilderness boundary on the high end, and the drift fences down low, and the cross fences between pastures, and all of it wood and wire, and all of it always going down somewhere, a post rotted off, or a wire broke, or a tree come down across a stretch in a wind, and a good part of any week was riding fence with a pair of pliers and a sack of staples on the saddle, finding the breaks and fixing them before the cattle found them first. There's water to see to, the springs and the dirt tanks, making sure they're running and clean, and that a cow hasn't bogged herself in the mud at the edge of one and died there. There's the cattle themselves to keep account of, riding through the bunches and counting and looking them over, watching for one that's gone lame, or one that's pink-eyed up, or a cow that's slipped her calf, doctoring what needs doctoring out of the bag I carried behind the cantle. There's salt to pack out to the salt grounds. There's pasture to rotate them through so you don't graze any one piece down to dirt. It's a lot of work for one man, and I did it alone, and I liked it that way. The long, quiet days, horseback in big country, with nobody to answer to, and nothing to do but the work in front of me. I'd come in at dark wore out in the good way a man gets wore out when he's done honest work, and I'd cook something on the stove and eat it and go to bed, and the next day I'd do it again. That was the life. I want you to have it clear in your head, the plainness of it, the ordinariness. Because the thing I'm going to tell you came into the middle of that ordinary life and unmade it a piece at a time, and the unmaking only means anything if you can first see how solid the thing was that got unmade. It started with a heifer in the middle of June. I found her on a Tuesday morning, I remember that much, because I'd been planning to ride the east fence that day, and I changed my plans when I came over a rise and saw the herd. They were bunched, now cattle bunch for reasons, and a man who knows them knows the reasons, and none of the good reasons were in play that morning. There was no storm, there wasn't a predator that I could see or smell, but there they were, 40-some head packed into a tight knot in the middle of an open park. Every one of them faced the same direction, looking off toward the timber on the wilderness side. Standing dead still, not grazing, not chewing, just looking. I sat my horse and looked with them for a while and saw nothing in that timber at all, and after a few minutes I rode down toward them and they didn't break, which was the first wrong thing, because they always break and drift when you come at them. They held, like something was holding them. The heifer was on the far side of the bunch, down on her side, and I knew she was dead before I got to her because of how she was lying. What I couldn't figure out was how. There wasn't a mark on her that I could find at first. No blood. No torn out throat the way a lion leaves them. No belly opened up by coyotes. None of the mess you expect. She was just dead, lying there with her eyes open and her legs straight out, and the grass around her wasn't disturbed. No drag marks, no sign of a struggle. A cow that's been killed by something fights, and the ground shows it, and there was nothing. It was like she'd lain down to die in a place she'd picked. I rolled her part way over to check the downside, and that's where I found it. On the underside of her neck, up high near the jaw, there was a single wound, small, maybe the size of the end of my thumb, punched clean through the hide and into her. No tearing around it. One hole, made by something that went in straight and came out straight. I'd never seen a thing like it on a cow in all my years, and I stood there a long time with my hand on her trying to make it be something I recognized. I couldn't. The herd never broke the whole time I worked over that carcass. When I finally got back on my horse and rode the bunch, hazing them out of the park and up toward better grass, they moved slow and reluctant and kept turning their heads back to that line of timber, and it took me the better part of an hour to get them moving like normal cattle again. I told myself it was a freak thing. A heifer can die of 100 causes, and the wound could have been a stub she fell on, a sharp branch, anything. That's what I told myself. I rode back 2 days later and dragged the carcass off with a rope and burned what the coyotes had left, and I put it out of my mind as best I could. It wasn't a freak thing. I know that now. It was the first one. It was the thing telling me it had arrived, and I just didn't have the language yet to hear what it was saying. The next 2 weeks were quiet enough that I'd almost talked myself all the way out of it. The cattle grazed and watered and acted right. I rode my fences and fixed what needed fixing. The spring was running good, and the grass was coming on heavy after a wet May, and a man can convince himself of a lot of normal when the country's giving him normal back. Then I lost a steer, and the second one took the last of my comfort with it. I found him the same way. The herd bunched and facing off toward the wilderness side, holding even when I came at them. He was down at the edge of a stand of timber this time, not out in the open. And when I got to him, the wound was the same. One hole, high on the throat, punched clean. But this time, there was something else, and it's the something else that I think about on the nights I can't sleep. There were tracks. The ground near him was soft from a seep that ran through there, just mud really, and pressed into that mud all around the carcass were prints I couldn't make sense of. Some of them were like a big cat, a lion, four-toed and round, except too big and the wrong shape. And some of them, right alongside, weren't animal at all. They were like a man's bare foot, a long, narrow human foot pressed deep into the mud, with toes, except the toes were too long, and there were marks at the end of them that a man's toes don't make, and the two kinds of track ran together, mixed up, like whatever made the cat tracks and whatever made the man tracks had been standing in the same place at the same time. Or, and this is the thought I couldn't shake even then, like it was the same thing, and it had changed from one to the other right there in the mud. I'm not a superstitious man. I want to keep saying that because I know how this sounds. I went to a one-room school and I read the Farmer's Almanac, and I believe in weather and grass and the price of beef, and not much past that. But I crouched there in that mud with my fingers on those tracks, and the hair came up on my arms, and the back of my neck the way it does when a lion's watching you, that you can't see. And I had the certain animal knowledge that I was being watched right then. I stood up slow, and I looked at that timber, and I didn't see anything. And I got on my horse, and I rode out of there at a pace that wasn't dignified, and I'm not ashamed of it. I went back to those tracks the next day, in better light, with my head a little more level, because that's the kind of man I am. I don't like a thing I can't account for, and I'll worry at it. I spent the better part of a morning on that piece of mud. I followed the tracks both directions as far as I could carry them. Going one way, away from the carcass, they led up toward the wilderness fence, and they were the cat tracks doing it, the big round wrong ones, spaced out long the way a big animal moves when it's covering ground without hurry. Going the other way, toward the carcass and past it, they changed. I found the place where they changed. I want to tell you I found a clean spot where one kind of track stopped and the other started, where I could have said here's where the trick happened, but it wasn't clean like that. It was a churned up patch of ground, like something had stood there and turned and worked its feet. And on the near side of that patch it was cat coming in, and on the far side of it was the long man feet going out. And in the middle it was just torn mud with both kinds mixed through it, and there was no reading it. I knelt there a long while trying to make it be two animals, a lion and a man, that had happened to use the same ground, and I couldn't, because the timing was wrong. The man feet came down on top of the cat tracks in some places, and the cat tracks came down on top of the man feet in others, back and forth, like whatever it was had gone from the one to the other, and back more than once, right there, turning in place. I have tracked game and predators my whole life, and I know what the ground tells you, and the ground was telling me a thing I did not want to hear. I started keeping a closer count after that, and a written one, which I'd never bothered with before because I'd always carried the herd in my head. I got a little notebook out of the supplies, the kind you'd keep a tally in, and I started writing down every animal I could put eyes on each day, and where, and what the herd was doing, and where I'd found them in the morning, versus where I'd left them at dark. I needed to see it written down to believe it, because the cattle were behaving in a way that a man can't quite credit while it's happening. And the notebook was the only thing that made it real, the same entry over and over in my own hand. Left them low park settled. Found them strung on the wilderness fence at dawn, ground cut to pieces between. Night after night. I'd read back over a week of those entries by lamplight in the cabin, and the writing made it worse, not better, because you can argue yourself out of one strange morning, but you can't argue with a week of them in a row in your own handwriting. That night, back at the line camp, I heard the first of what I'd come to hear a lot of that summer. I'd gone to bed early, worn down, and I came awake in the full dark with no idea what had woke me, the way you do. The cabin was dead quiet, and then out past the wall, out in the dark of the meadow, something made a sound. It was a cow. I'd swear to you on anything you put in front of me that it was one of my cows, a low bawling call, the sound a cow makes when she's lost her calf and is looking for it. Except I knew every animal on that allotment, and none of my cows had a calf at that time, and the sound was coming from up the slope, away from where I'd bedded the herd, up toward the wilderness fence. It would call and go quiet, and then call again from a slightly different spot, working back and forth along the slope. I lay there in the dark and listened to it, and my whole body knew that it wasn't a cow. A cow doesn't move that fast between calls. A cow doesn't go that quiet in between. It was something making the sound a cow makes, and doing it to see if I'd come out, and I did not come out. I lay there until it stopped, sometime in the small hours, and I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning I rode down to headquarters. I told myself it was for salt and a few groceries, but it was really because I wanted to be around another human being for a few hours. Harlan was there, and his nearest neighbor on that side of the country had come by, an old fellow named Benny Sosi, who ran a few horses and some sheep on his own ground a ways down the valley. Benny was Navajo, Dine, and he'd lived in that country his whole life, longer even than me, and he and I had always got along fine over the years, the way two old men who both know cattle and horses get along. We'd shared coffee 100 times. That morning I was glad to see him, and I sat down with the two of them, and we talked weather and grass for a while. And then Harlan asked me how things were up at the allotment, just making conversation, and I made the mistake of telling the truth. I told him about the heifer and the steer, the wounds. I didn't say much about the tracks, just that I'd seen sign I couldn't read, and I didn't say anything at all about the thing in the night, because I wasn't ready to say that part out loud yet. Harlan made the noises a man makes, lion probably, or somebody's dog gone wild, and he wasn't real interested, because Harlan was never real interested in anything to do with those cattle. But I'd been watching Benny while I talked, and Benny had gone still. He'd set his coffee down, and when I mentioned about where it was happening, up against the wilderness fence on the high end of the allotment, and described the spot, Benny stood up. He didn't make a scene. He just said he had to get back to his place, that he'd been gone too long already, and he shook Harlan's hand, and he looked at me for a second, a long second, with something in his face I'd never seen there before. Then he left. I didn't think much of it right then, but I noticed that he didn't say the easy things a man says on his way out, the see you around and take care kind of things. He just looked at me and went. And here's the part I want you to hold on to. Benny Sosi had been stopping by Harlan's place, and stopping by my camp when he was up that way, for as long as I'd ridden for that outfit. After that morning, he stopped. He didn't come around once for the rest of that summer, not once. And it was a good while before I understood why. I rode back up to the allotment that afternoon with a bad feeling I couldn't put down. And the bad feeling was right, because that was the week it stopped killing cattle every so often and started working on me. The bawling came most nights now. Sometimes it was the cow sound, the lost calf bawl, working the slope above the camp. Sometimes it was other things, One night it was a calf, a young calf crying, which we didn't have, and it cried right up close to the cabin, just outside the window where the firewood was stacked, close enough that if it had been a real calf, I could have reached out and touched it. I lay in my bunk with my rifle across my chest, and I listened to that calf cry not 8 feet from my head, and I did not get up, and I did not open the door, because by then I had learned. Another night, it was coyotes, a whole pack of them yipping and singing the way they do, except it went on too long and too steady, and it never moved the way a real pack moves. And underneath the coyote sound, there was something else, a kind of low note that doesn't belong in a coyote, and I lay and listened to that too. The thing had 100 voices. That's the part that I think finally broke something loose in me, the understanding that it could be anything it wanted to be, that it had been listening to that country its whole long life, and it had every sound in it memorized, and it could put any one of them on like a man putting on a coat. I learned the rhythm of those nights whether I wanted to or not. It would start after full dark, never before, and never with the worst sound first. It would start far off, up the slope, with something ordinary, the cow ball usually, and it would work that one sound for a while, moving along the slope. And a man lying in the dark listening could almost talk himself into believing it really was a cow. That's how good it was, the first hour of it. And then it would come closer, and the sounds would start to change. And the closer it came, the less the sounds belonged. By the deep middle of the night, it would be near the cabin, and it would be running through things that had no business in that country at all. And the worst of it was never loud. The worst of it was always quiet, close, just past the wall, a small sound made right up against the logs where I was lying on the other side, like it knew exactly where my head was and was putting the sound there on purpose. I started sleeping with the lamp lit. I started sleeping with the rifle in the bed. I started some nights not sleeping at all, just sitting up against the back wall with the lamp and the gun watching that door. And the thing seemed to know which nights those were, because the nights I sat up watching were the nights it worked the hardest, came the closest, ran through the most of its catalog, like it could feel me awake in there and was working on me, and the nights I finally gave out and slept were quieter, like it was content to let me sleep because a man who sleeps will sleep again, and deeper, and someday all the way through, and it could wait for that night the way it had waited for everything else. The cattle were coming apart. I'd ride out in the mornings and find the herd bunched and facing the timber more days than not now, and it was getting harder and harder to settle them and move them. They were going off their feed. A cow that won't graze loses condition fast, and my cattle were starting to show ribs in the middle of the best grass year we'd had in a decade, because they were spending their days standing in a knot staring at the wilderness side, and their nights doing God knows what. Because I'd find them in the mornings, in places I hadn't left them, packed up against fence corners or jammed into the bottoms of draws, like they'd spent the dark hours running from one end of the allotment to the other. I lost a third animal in the second week of July, a good cow this time, and the wound was the same, the single clean hole high on the throat, and the tracks were the same, the big wrong cat prints, and the long human feet mixed together in the dirt by the carcass. And this time there was one more thing, the gate. There was a wire gate in the wilderness fence on the high end of the allotment, a gate I kept shut and tied because there wasn't any reason to have it open, and every reason to keep my cattle on my side of the line. It was the kind of gate that's just a section of the fence you can take down, 4 wires stretched on a loose post that you lever into a wire loop top and bottom to hold it shut. I'd tied the top loop with a piece of baling wire on top of the loop because the wire had gone slack over the years, and I didn't trust the loop alone. That morning, when I came up on the dead cow, the gate was open. Standing wide open, the loose post laid back on the ground and the wires slack, and my baling wire wasn't broke. It was untwisted. Somebody, or something, had untwisted the baling wire I'd wrapped, the same way I'd have done it myself with 2 hands and time, and laid the gate open, and the cow had died 10 feet from that open gate on my side of it. I want to tell you what that did to me, standing there looking at that gate. A lion doesn't open a gate. A bear doesn't open a gate, not by untwisting wire. A man could open that gate, but no man had any reason to be up there, 10 miles from the nearest road, in country that takes a hard half-day's ride to reach, and no man kills a cow with one clean hole and leaves no other sign. I stood there and I made myself say it, finally, out loud, alone up there with the dead cow and the open gate. I said the word I'd been keeping away from for a month. I'd heard it over the years, the way anybody who works that country hears it, mostly from people half joking, and once or twice from people who weren't joking at all. Skinwalker. The Dine have a name for it that they don't like to say, and a lot of them won't talk about it at all. And the white man word for it, the word that's gotten into all the stories, is Skinwalker. A thing that was a person, or had been, that can wear the shape of an animal, that can throw its voice, that knows the country, and works it. I'd always thought of that as a story to scare children with. Standing at that gate, I didn't think it was a story anymore. I thought it was the only thing that fit, and I thought it had figured out the gate, and I thought it was working its way in toward me a little at a time, and I was right on all 3 counts. I closed the gate. I twisted the wire back. I rode the herd off that high pasture entirely, pushed them down to the lower country near my camp where the fence ran along a county road, and there was at least the idea of other people somewhere out past the trees. And for a few days I thought maybe I'd done something. Maybe putting distance between the herd and that boundary had bought me some peace. It hadn't. It had just told the thing that I'd learned the gate, and so it learned something new. It started coming into the camp meadow at night. The first night I knew it was close. I didn't hear a cow or a calf or a coyote. I heard my own name. I came awake in the dark, and there was a voice out past the cabin wall, low, calling my name the way Harlan calls it when he rides up, the way a man calls another man he knows. It said my name, and then it said something about the truck, that the truck was stuck, that I needed to come give him a hand, and the voice was Harlan's voice, near enough that if I'd been half asleep and not paying attention, I might have believed it. But Harlan was 40 miles away, and Harlan's truck couldn't get within 10 miles of my camp because there wasn't a road, and Harlan would no more ride up to my camp in the dead middle of the night than he'd fly. And I lay there in the black with that thing wearing my boss's voice calling me to come outside, and I understood exactly what it was doing. It wanted me out the door. Everything it had done for a month. The cattle, the wounds, the voices working closer and closer in the dark. All of it had been working toward getting me to open that door and walk out into the meadow in the dark. And it had run through the whole catalog of sounds the country had, and now it had landed on the one that might actually work. The voice of somebody I knew, somebody I'd come out for. I didn't come out. I called back through the door, and I'm not proud of how my voice sounded, but I called back and I said I knew it wasn't Harlan, and it could go to hell, and the voice stopped. Just stopped, mid-word almost, the way nothing real stops. And then there was a sound I'll hear until I die, a sound right up against the cabin wall, a low sound that wasn't any animal and wasn't any man, somewhere down underneath both, and then nothing. Quiet the rest of the night, but I sat up against the wall with my rifle and a lamp burning, and I watched that door until the sky went gray, and I made up my mind sometime in those hours that I wasn't going to win this by hiding in a cabin. It already knew where the cabin was. It already knew I was in it. The cabin wasn't keeping it out. I was, by not opening the door, and a man's got to sleep. And the night I finally slept all the way through was the night it would get what it wanted. I rode down to headquarters the next day to think, and to be around Harlan, and because I'd half decided to quit. I'll be honest with you about that. I'd worked cattle through blizzards and droughts and a lightning strike that killed my horse out from under me. And I'd never once thought about walking off a job. And that morning I thought about it hard. But Benny Sosie's truck was at Harlan's place when I rode up, the first time I'd seen it since that morning a month before. And Benny was sitting on Harlan's porch. And when I came up, he looked at me, and he stood up, and he came down off the porch to meet me. And I knew he'd come there to find me. He'd come to say something. And what he said, standing out by my horse where Harlan couldn't hear, was the thing that saved my life, though it didn't sound like much at the time. He didn't say a whole lot. He asked me, low, where it was killing the cattle, and I told him, up high, against the wilderness fence, and below the fence after I moved them down. And he nodded like that confirmed something he already feared, and he said a few things that I'm not going to repeat all of, because some of it was his and not mine to give away, and because some of it I promised him I'd keep. But the part that matters, the part he wanted me to have, was about the line. He told me that thing belonged to the country on the far side of that wilderness fence, that it was tied to that ground the way the water was tied to the springs, that it ranged and it hunted, and it was clever past anything I'd dealt with, but that it was held somehow to its own country, and that the old boundary, the fence, the line my cattle's allotment butted up against, that line meant something to it that it didn't to me. He said the thing had been crossing because I'd left the way open. The gate, the slack wire. He said it would keep working its way across as long as there was a way across and a reason to come, but that it didn't want to be out of its own country any longer than it had to, that it was always pulling back toward the wilderness side, and that if I understood that, I had the only thing I needed to understand. I want to be careful how I tell the rest, because the rest is what I actually did, and I've turned it over in my mind 10,000 times since, and I still believe it was the only thing that could have worked. I rode back up to the allotment that evening with a different idea in my head than the one I'd come down with. I wasn't going to quit, and I wasn't going to sit in that cabin one more night waiting for it to find the voice I'd opened the door for. I was going to give it what it wanted, which was for me to come out, and I was going to do it on my terms and at the time of my choosing, and I was going to use the one thing Benny had told me, that the thing itself couldn't change. It was held to its own country. It wanted always to pull back across that line. So I was going to put the whole herd across the line for it and let it have the wilderness side and take the allotment back. I know that sounds backward. Let me lay it out the way I worked it out. The thing was killing my cattle and working on me, drawing closer every night. And the cattle were going to be dead by fall the way things were going. Every one of them either killed outright or run to bone. I couldn't fight it because I couldn't even see it. And what I could see, the cat tracks and the man tracks and the open gate, told me it was smarter and faster than anything I could lay a sight on. But it had a country, and the country had an edge, the wilderness fence, and on the far side of that edge was the thing's home ground, and the thing always wanted to go back to it. So if I drove my cattle off the allotment, off my permitted ground entirely, away from the boundary, down and out toward the county road and the lower country, where there were ranches and people and lights. And at the same time, I opened that high gate wide and left the thing's own country open to it. Then there'd be nothing left on the allotment that it wanted. No cattle to kill. No man sleeping in a cabin to draw out into the dark. Just an open gate to its own ground and nothing on this side worth crossing for. Benny had told me it didn't want to be out of its country. I was going to make sure there was no reason left for it to be. It took me 3 days to gather the herd, working alone, and they were a wreck. Cattle that won't drive are about the most miserable thing a man can deal with, and these had spent a month being terrorized, and they were spooky and gaunt and prone to break in every direction. And I had 2 good horses, and I wore both of them down, and most of myself with them. The first day, I didn't gather much of anything. I just located them, because they'd scattered themselves all over that allotment in their nightly running, and they were holed up in 1s and 2s and little bunches in every draw and timber pocket on the place. A man gathers cattle by working them out of the rough and pushing them toward a holding ground, easy, slow, letting them string along, and that works when the cattle are settled. These weren't settled. I'd find a little bunch of them jammed up in the head of a canyon, and I'd start to ease them out and they'd break on me, scatter back past the horse in 3 directions, and I'd have to gather that same little bunch over again, and they'd break again. And a thing that should have taken an hour took half a day and left my horse lathered and my temper gone. They wouldn't lead and they wouldn't drive, and they'd lost the herd sense that makes cattle want to be together, because the thing had spent a month teaching them that together in a bunch facing the timber was where the dying happened. And now every animal wanted to be off by itself in the brush, which is the hardest way in the world to gather anything. I'd get 4 head moving toward the low park, and lose 2 of them into a thicket, and have to leave the 2 I'd lost to keep the 4 I had, and then come back for the 2, and it went like that the whole first day, and at the end of it I had maybe a third of the herd loosely bunched in the low park, and the light was going, and I had to ride back to the camp for the night knowing the thing would scatter again in the dark whatever I'd gathered in the day, and it did. The second day was the first day over again, except worse, because now I was tired and the horses were tired, and the cattle had learned the day before that they could break past me and get away with it. I switched horses at noon, rode the second one into the same lather as the first by dark. I lost count of how many times I gathered the same animals and lost them and gathered them again. There's a particular kind of worn out that comes from working stock that won't be worked, where it isn't the body so much as something behind the eyes that wears down. The steady grinding failure of it, push and break and push and break. And by the end of that second day, I had a little more than half the herd held in the low park, and I was about used up. And the thing in the dark that night seemed to know it, and worked me hard, and scattered what I'd gathered. And I started the third day with less than I'd ended the second. But the third day it turned, the way a gather sometimes does once enough of the cattle are together that the herd sense comes back into them. Once I had a big enough bunch held in the low park, the loose ones wanted to come to it, because a cow's nature is to be with other cattle, and that nature finally got the better of the fear, and the gathering got easier through that last day instead of harder. By the middle of the afternoon, I was bringing in the last stragglers to a herd that was holding itself together, and by evening I had them, all of them I could account for, bunched down in the lower park near the road, and I held them there overnight. And that last night was the worst of all of them, because the thing knew. I'd swear it knew. It came in close that night, closer than it ever had, working the dark all around the bedded herd, and it ran the whole catalog. It bawled like a lost cow. It cried like a calf. It called my name in Harlan's voice and then in Benny's voice, which it had never done before, which meant it had been close enough to us at Harlan's place to learn Benny's voice in one afternoon, and that turned my stomach worse than anything. It even, once, late, made a sound like a woman. And I'd lost my wife 8 years before that summer, and I won't tell you what that did to me to hear, out there in the dark, a sound like her. And I'll only tell you that I bit down, and I held the herd, and I did not answer, and I did not move toward it. The cattle were near to stampeding all night, and I rode that bunch in the dark till my horse was staggering, keeping them together, and the thing worked us the whole night long, and somewhere toward morning I understood that it had stopped trying to draw me out, and started just trying to scatter the herd, because it knew, it had figured out what I meant to do, and it was trying to bust the cattle loose and keep them on the allotment because the cattle were the only reason left for it to have a hold on me. I held them. I don't know how, but I held them, and the sky came gray, and then pink, and the thing went quiet the way it always did with the light, and I had a herd, ragged and terrified but whole, in the lower park by the road at dawn. I pushed them out that morning. The lower park where I'd gathered them was already a few miles down off the high country from the wilderness fence, and from there I drove the whole bunch off the allotment entirely, down the county road to a neighbor's holding pasture I'd raised him about on the radio, 10 miles of road with the cattle strung out and stumbling, and me and my last fresh horse working the drag, and it was the longest 10 miles of my life, and the easiest, because every step took them farther from that wilderness boundary, and I could feel the country letting go of them as we went, or maybe just feel myself letting go. By noon they were behind a good fence on the neighbor's place, with the neighbor's hand watching them, a good 15 miles of country between them and the wilderness line all told, and a world away. And then I did the second half, which I'd thought about the whole drive down, and which I did alone, and which I'll tell you took more nerve than anything else in my life. I rode back up, alone, all the way back up to the high end of the empty allotment, to the wilderness gate, in the afternoon while there was still good light, and I opened that gate wide. I untwisted my own wire and I laid the loose post back, and I stretched the 4 wires down, and I left the way to its own country standing open, the way it had wanted it open all along. I gave it back its boundary, open, and then, and this is the part I did that Benny hadn't told me to do, that was mine. I rode the whole length of that high fence, and I opened every other gate and gap I could reach, and where the fence was good and tight, I cut it. Now a man doesn't just walk up and snip a 4-strand fence that's stretched tight, not unless he wants a strand of barbed wire to come back across his face and take an eye out, or whip up under his horse and cut the animal to ribbons, because there's a lot of pull in a tight fence, and it comes loose all at once, and mean. So I killed the tension first the way you're supposed to, pulled the staples loose for a few posts on either side with the claw of the pliers, so the wire went slack along that stretch, and stood off to the side of it, and let what tension was left out of it easy before I ever made a cut. Then I cut my own employer's wilderness boundary fence in 3 places along that high stretch, careful and slack and from the side, so that the line wasn't a barrier at all anymore on the allotment side, so that the thing's own country wasn't fenced off from the empty ground, where there was nothing left to kill. I made the whole edge open. I gave it everything on its side, and I took everything off of mine, the cattle, the man, all of it, and I left that allotment as empty of anything it could want as I could make it, with its own wild country standing wide open to it the whole length of the line. Then I rode out. I didn't spend another night in that camp. I rode down in the last of the light and the first of the dark, down off that allotment for the last time. And I'll tell you the truth, the thing followed me part way. I heard it, working the timber off to the side of the trail as I rode down, keeping pace, the way it had kept pace with the herd. It bawled once, far off. It called my name once, Harlan's voice, fainter. And then, somewhere down low, as the trail came off the high country and the lights of the valley showed away out ahead, it quit. It just quit and fell back, and I rode the last of the way down through a quiet I hadn't known in a month. And I understood, the way I'd understood the wrong things all summer, that it had turned back, that it had reached the edge of what it would do, the edge of its own country pulling at it, and with nothing left on the allotment to hold it, and its own ground standing open behind it, it had let me go and gone home. I never grazed that high section again. Harlan asked me about the cut fence, and I told him I'd cut it, and I told him why, the whole of it. And Harlan looked at me the way you'd look at a man you'd known a long time who'd just told you something that made you wonder if you'd ever known him at all. And then he didn't say anything more about it. And I think that's because some part of Harlan, who'd grown up in that country whatever he pretended, knew enough not to push. We pulled the permit on the high end, ran cattle only on the lower allotment after that, miles back from the wilderness line, and we put up a new fence well down from the old boundary, and I never once, in the years I had left on that outfit, took a single head up against that line again. The cattle did fine on the lower ground. We never lost another one to a clean hole in the throat, and I never again heard a cow bawl in the night that turned out not to be a cow. Benny Tsosi started coming around again, after, not right away. But sometime that fall, his truck showed up at Harlan's place again, and he sat on the porch and drank coffee the way he always had. And the day I saw him there, I went and sat down by him, and neither one of us said much. And after a while he asked me, low, if I'd left it open, the line. I said I had. I said I'd opened every gate and cut the fence in 3 places and given it the whole far side. And Benny nodded, slow, and he looked off toward the mountains, and he said one thing, and then we never spoke of it again, not once, in the years we both had left. He said that I'd done right, that most people, when that thing comes, fight it or run from it, and both of those keep them tangled up with it, because fighting it and running from it are both about you and it, and what it wants is for it to be about you and it. He said the only way clear was to make it not about you at all, to take yourself and everything you cared about clean out of it, and give the thing its own country back, and leave it nothing of yours to want. He said I was one of the few he'd ever known who'd worked that out in time, and then he drank his coffee, and we talked about the price of hay, and that was the end of it. That was a long time ago now. I'm an old man, older than Benny was that summer, and Benny's gone, and Harlan's gone, and the outfit's been sold twice over, and I don't know who runs cattle on that lower allotment now, or whether they know to stay down off the line. I've never told this to many people because most people, when you tell them, get a look. And I understand the look, because I'd have had it myself before that summer. But I'll tell you what I know, for whatever it's worth to you, and then I'm done. There is a country up against the Gila Wilderness boundary where something lives that I don't have a name for, except the name that's gotten into all the stories, the Skinwalker, and that name is probably wrong, and probably an insult to people who know better than I do what it really is. I don't claim to understand it. I only met it the one summer, and I only got clear of it the one way, and I've spent the rest of my life grateful that an old man named Benny Sosi cared enough to come find me at a porch on a summer morning and tell me the one thing that thing couldn't change about itself. It belongs to its own country. It always wants to go home. And if you ever find yourself across the line from a thing like that, the only thing I know to tell you is don't fight it and don't run. Just give it back its ground. Take everything of yours away and leave it nothing of yours to come for. That's all I've got. That's the whole of it. I haven't been up that high since, and I never will be again, and I sleep fine these days, and when I hear a cow bawl in the night now, I know it's a cow, and you've no idea, you can't have any idea, what a mercy that is. I'm changing names because one of the people in this story still won't talk about it, and another one asked me not to post this at all. I'm not from Minnesota originally, but I've lived in the Twin Cities long enough that people assume I am. I've done the North Shore thing, the Duluth weekend thing, the rent a cabin and pretend you like saunas thing. I'd hiked plenty, camped plenty, and been in woods that felt big. The Boundary Waters was different, and I didn't understand that until we were already too far in. There were 4 of us, me, Kellen, Mira, and Soren. We were all late 20s, old enough to know better than to do dumb outdoor stuff just because it looked cool online, and apparently still young enough to do exactly that. Mira was the one who actually knew what she was doing. She'd done 2 trips up there with her dad when she was younger, owned a real rain jacket, knew how to hang a food pack, and didn't roll her eyes when the outfitter in Ely spent 15 minutes explaining things we thought we already understood. Kellen was Kellen, loud, funny, always trying to turn everything into a bit. He was the reason we had too much whiskey and not enough dry socks. He was also the reason we had permits in the first place, because he'd gotten obsessed with canoe camping after watching some guy on YouTube cook lake trout over a fire grate. Soren was quiet. Not shy exactly, just one of those people who never wastes words. He'd go 6 hours without saying anything and then casually point out that everyone was paddling toward the wrong bay. I was somewhere in the middle. I liked being outside, liked maps, liked the idea of being the calm guy in a bad situation. Before this trip, I thought those things were enough. We went in late September, after most of the bugs, but before the weather got truly stupid. At least that was the plan. We entered at Moose River North, entry point 16, off the Echo Trail, because Mira said it was pretty, manageable, and had enough traffic that we wouldn't be completely alone if something went wrong. That last part feels funny now. We picked up our permit in Ely, loaded 2 rented Kevlar canoes, bought leeches we never used, and repacked everything 3 times in the outfitter's parking lot because Kellen had brought a cast iron skillet. Mira made him leave it in the car. He complained about it for 10 miles. The outfitter dropped us at the entry lot with our canoes, packs, paddles, and too much confidence. There were 2 other vehicles parked there, both with canoe foam blocks still on the roofs, and someone had left a crushed Busch Light can on a rock near the lot. Mira picked it up and shoved it into Kellen's pack because he was the one closest to it. The first portage humbled us. It didn't destroy us, just shut everybody up for a while. The trail was wet and rooty, and the canoes were light compared to aluminum, sure, but light is a word people use when they aren't the one carrying it on their shoulders with mosquitoes finding the only exposed strip of skin behind their ears. When we finally reached the water, the whole world seemed to drop in volume. Not silent. People always say the deep woods are silent, but they aren't. There was water moving through grass, paddles dripping, wind in black spruce, a raven somewhere, the little plastic click of someone adjusting a life jacket. It was quiet in a way that made every small sound feel watched. We paddled the Moose River with Mira and Soren in one canoe and me and Kellen in the other. Kellen kept turning around to talk, which made us fishtail every 30 seconds. The river twisted through marsh and low trees, and we passed a beaver dam where we had to get out and drag over. Kellen sank one leg to the knee in mud and yelled like he'd been shot. Mira told him to stop wasting energy. Soren just stood there holding the bowline, looking downriver. I asked him what he was looking at. He shook his head, which was Soren for nothing. With him, that meant either nothing or something he didn't feel like explaining. We got to Ninamoose Lake in early afternoon. The wind came up right as we left the river mouth, and the lake looked bigger than I expected. Not huge, but after the narrow river it felt exposed. Small waves slapped the canoe sideways, and Kellen stopped making jokes for the first time since Ely. We crossed to the north side and took a campsite Mira liked because it had decent trees for the food pack and a clear view of the water. It was a normal Boundary Waters campsite. Steel fire grate, flat tent pad, a little trail back to the latrine. Someone had left a stack of split cedar tucked under a rock, dry enough to use, which felt like a gift. We set up 2 tents. Mira and I took one. Kellen and Soren took the other. That wasn't a couple's thing. Mira and I weren't dating. We just both refused to sleep in the same tent as Kellen because he snored like a chainsaw trying to start underwater. Dinner was instant potatoes with summer sausage cut into it. Kellen called it prison food and ate 2 bowls. The lake went glassy at sunset. Loons called from somewhere we couldn't see, and for a while the whole trip felt exactly like it was supposed to. Then Kellen started making animal noises. I don't mean he was howling at the moon or anything. He was doing that dumb thing people do around campfires where they try to sound like a wolf, then a coyote, then something they insist is a cougar even though nobody believes them. Mira told him to knock it off. He did one more long strangled call across the water, and the echo came back wrong. It didn't return all at once. It bounced around the lake in pieces, like the far shore was answering with different parts of his voice. Soren looked up from cleaning his mug. Kellen grinned and asked if he was scared of Bigfoot. Soren didn't answer. Mira threw a pine cone at Kellen's chest and told him people came out there for quiet. Kellen raised both hands and said, "Fine, no more summoning skinwalkers." Mira snapped at him harder than she needed to. "Don't call things," she said. We all kind of laughed, because it sounded like something her dad had probably told her when she was 12. She didn't laugh. Kellen apologized in that half-joking way people do when they aren't actually sorry, and the night moved on. Nothing else happened then. I wish it had. I wish something had walked right into camp, something obvious with glowing eyes and antlers and hands. Then we would have left the next morning. We would have known what kind of story we were in. Instead, it started small. I woke up around 2 in the morning because I had to piss. I lay there for a minute trying to convince myself I didn't. Mira was asleep on the other side of the tent, breathing quietly, and rain ticked on the fly, not heavy, just enough to make me hate the idea of leaving my sleeping bag. Then I heard a paddle knock against the side of a canoe. It was faint but clear, wood or plastic on Kevlar, a hollow little tap. I froze, listening, and heard it again, followed by a scrape like someone dragging a canoe over gravel. I thought maybe Kellen had gotten up. He'd been talking about fishing at dawn, so maybe he was messing with the gear. I whispered his name once, then remembered he was in the other tent. The sound came again. Scrape. Pause. Tap. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stuck my head out. The campsite was gray and black. I could see the fire grate, the packs under the tarp, the pale shape of the other tent, and beyond that, the lake as a darker flatness between trees. Both of our canoes were upside down where we'd left them, pulled well above the waterline. The sound came from the lake. At first I thought it was a log. Then it moved. A canoe slid across the water, maybe 50 yards out from camp. No headlamp, no lantern, just a long, low shape barely separated from the dark water by a strip of reflection. There were 2 people in it, or at least I thought there were. One shape sat in the stern and one in the bow, Between them, something pale lay across the middle, longer than a pack and too lumpy to be a paddle bag. The canoe moved without any visible paddle strokes. I don't mean they were paddling silently. I mean, I didn't see paddles at all. The canoe just drifted left to right, steady, like it was being pulled by a rope. I watched it pass behind a little point of spruce and vanish. A few seconds later, from the direction it had gone, I heard Kellen laugh. Not loud, not campfire loud. More like someone laughing to himself because he got away with something. I turned toward the other tent, but there was no movement. I almost called out, but something about the lake stopped me. It felt childish at the time, like I was letting the dark spook me. Still, I didn't call. I pissed behind a tree, got back in my sleeping bag with wet feet, and lay awake until morning. When I told everyone at breakfast, Kellen loved it. He immediately started saying ghost canoe and lake people, and asking if I was sure I hadn't been dreaming. Mira asked better questions. Which direction? How far out? Did it have a permit tag? Did I hear paddles? Was the pale thing a dog? I didn't know the answer to most of it. Soren walked down to where our canoes were pulled up and crouched beside the one Kellen and I had used. I followed him. There were handprints on the side, wet ones. At first, that didn't seem impossible. The canoes had been wet when we carried them up. Dew, rain, lake water. But these were distinct. 4 fingers and a thumb on the side near the stern, angled like someone had gripped it from underneath. Then I saw another set on the inside lip. Mira came over and touched one. Her face changed. The fingers were too long. Not horror movie long, not claws. Just long enough that once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The fingertips reached farther than they should have, and the thumb was set low, almost wrong. Kellen tried to put his hand over it. His fingers didn't reach. Soren held up both hands from where he stood. Mira wiped the print away with her sleeve and said it was probably one of the other campers. Nobody asked why another camper would come into our sight in the rain, touch our canoe, and leave without taking anything. We packed up after breakfast and headed north toward Agnes. The sky stayed low. The wind wasn't bad, but the whole day had a damp weight to it. We did the portages, loaded and unloaded, paddled stretches of river, and fell into that rhythm where conversation becomes mostly practical. Watch the rock, lift the stern. Whose water bottle is this? Don't step there. Kellen tried to bring the mood back a few times, but even he seemed off. He kept glancing behind us. At one portage, I noticed a footprint in the mud near the landing. Barefoot. I'd like to say it was huge, but it wasn't. It was about normal size, maybe a little longer than mine, only pressed deep. The mud around it had squeezed up between the toes. There was only one. I didn't mention it. That's one of the parts I still feel bad about. We reached Agnes in the afternoon and took a site on the west side after passing 2 occupied ones. One had a blue tarp, 2 canoes, and a guy in a red jacket standing near shore with a coffee mug. He raised the mug as we paddled by, and Kellen raised his paddle back. The next site looked empty from the water, so we landed, but there was a smell near the grate. Not rot exactly, not outhouse. It smelled like wet dog and old fish. Mira found a pile of gray hair stuck in the fire grate, like someone had burned fur and not finished. We got back in the canoes. Kellen said it was probably from somebody cleaning a rabbit. Mira asked who hunts rabbits from a canoe in the boundary waters. He said he didn't know, maybe Canadians. We paddled to the next site and stayed there. That night, we kept things quiet. No animal noises, no ghost canoe jokes. Kellen still drank some whiskey, but not enough to get loud. The temperature dropped fast after dark. We ate noodles, hung the food pack, and sat around the fire until the wood burned low. Across the lake, we saw a light blink once, then again. Headlamp probably. Someone moving around camp. It was far enough that you couldn't place the shoreline exactly. Kellen watched it for a while and said it could be the guy in the red jacket. Mira said it could be. The light blinked again, 3 quick flashes, then nothing. Around midnight, something walked through our sight. I was asleep, then I wasn't. No dream, no slow waking. 1 second I was out. The next I had my eyes open and my whole body knew something was wrong. Footsteps moved past the tent, soft and careful on pine needles. They weren't big crashing animal steps. They were human steps. That was worse. Mira was awake too. I could hear it in how she held her breath. The steps stopped between our tent and the water. Then Kellen whispered from outside, "Guys?" Mira's hand found my wrist in the dark and squeezed hard enough to hurt. Kellen whispered again, closer to the lake, telling us to come look at something. I didn't move. From the other tent, Kellen snored. It wasn't his usual full snore. It was softer, but it was him. I knew because he made this weird catch in his throat every few breaths, like a little hiccup. The voice outside sounded like Kellen, but Kellen was asleep 10 feet away. Mira put her mouth next to my ear and barely breathed. "Don't answer." I couldn't have answered anyway. The shape outside our tent shifted. I could see a shadow pass across the gray sidewall, darker than the dark around it. It bent down, or leaned in. The voice changed. It was still Kellen, but quieter, more careful. "Your canoe's gone." In the other tent, Kellen snored again. The thing outside waited. I could hear rain ticking on the leaves, water on rocks, and my own heartbeat in my ears so hard it made me dizzy. Then the footsteps moved away from the tent, down to the landing. There was a scrape, then a tap. A canoe being pulled over stone. I almost got up then. Fear does stupid things to your priorities. Part of my brain went, "We need those canoes. We can't leave without them." Mira held my wrist like she knew exactly what I was thinking. The scraping stopped. From the water, Kellen's voice whispered, "Okay, stay there." Then something laughed. Not like Kellen this time. More like someone trying to remember how laughing worked. In the morning, both canoes were still there. One was upside down exactly where we'd left it. The other had been turned right side up and dragged so that the bow pointed straight at the lake. Inside it, lined neatly along the bottom, were 4 smooth stones. The stones were wet, not from rain. The canoe had been under trees. Everything else had a fine mist on it, but those stones shone like they'd just been taken from underwater. Kellen didn't make jokes. He listened while Mira and I told him what happened. Soren stood off to the side, looking out at the lake. When I got to the part about hearing Kellen snore in the tent while Kellen's voice was outside, Kellen went pale in a way I'd never seen. He looked offended almost, like the woods had done something personal. He said he didn't get up. He said he didn't say anything. Soren finally asked if the voice had come from by the water. Mira nodded. Soren looked at Kellen and told him not to talk near the water that day. Kellen asked what that meant. Soren just repeated it. That should have sounded ridiculous. It didn't. We should have left then. I know that. Anyone reading this is probably already mad at us. I get it. I'm mad at us too. But leaving didn't feel simple. We were 2 days in, had a route planned, and Mira thought pushing back south against wind might be worse than continuing toward Oyster and looping around like planned. Also, nothing had actually hurt us. That was the stupid sentence that kept floating around without anyone saying it. Nothing had actually hurt us. We packed quickly and barely spoke. That day was when the route started to go wrong, not in a dramatic way. The map still made sense. The lakes were where they were supposed to be. The portages were marked. We weren't magically transported or anything. It was worse because everything was just a little off. A campsite we expected to see on the right side of a bay was on the left. Mira said the map might be turned wrong, but it wasn't. A portage listed as short took long enough that Kellen dropped his pack and checked the map twice. It had to be the right trail. There was nowhere else for it to go. Still, it felt like it stretched while we walked it. Same rocks, same roots, same muddy dip, then a bend where there hadn't been one before. Soren didn't talk. At the Oyster River, we had to get out twice for beaver dams. The second one had fresh mud smeared high on the sticks, almost chest level. Kellen started to say something, saw Soren looking at him, and shut his mouth. We reached Oyster Lake tired and irritable. The first campsite we tried was taken, or at least it looked taken. There was a canoe pulled up on shore. Old aluminum, dull silver, dented along one side. That alone was weird because most people out there had Kevlar or Royalex rentals, but not impossible. A lot of old aluminum canoes are still around. There were no people, though. No tent, no tarp, no smoke from the grate. Just the canoe at the landing, wet inside, with no paddles visible. We stayed out in the water and looked. Mira called hello before any of us could stop her. Soren snapped his head toward her. She realized it at the same time we did. The word crossed the lake and came back thin. Hello, hello, hello. From the trees above the campsite, something answered in Mira's voice. Hello? Kellen whispered, Nope. We paddled away fast. Not sprinting, not splashing, because nobody wanted to make noise, but hard enough that my shoulders burned. I looked back once. The aluminum canoe was still there. Then I blinked, and it was turned slightly, bow following us. I told myself wind. The next campsite was open and high up on a rock. We took it because we were tired, and because the landing was too steep for anything to sneak up from the water without making noise. That was our logic anyway. We set the tents farther back than normal. Mira insisted on keeping the canoes pulled up into camp, not just above the water line. Kellen and I carried one canoe almost to the fire grate before Soren stopped us and silently pointed to a spot between two trees. We ate early. Nobody wanted a fire, but Mira said a cold, dark camp would feel worse. She was right. We made a small one. Kellen sat with his back against a pine and kept rubbing his hands over his face. Eventually, quietly, he said he shouldn't have said Skinwalker. Mira didn't look at him. She said that wasn't even the right place. He said he knew. She said that wasn't what this was. He said he knew. But none of us knew what this was, and that word stayed in the air anyway. After dinner, I walked back to the latrine trail with my headlamp. I didn't want to go alone, but I didn't want to ask anyone to come with me either. Pride is dumb, but it's also stubborn. The latrine was where it should have been. A box in the woods, damp leaves, old toilet paper people had failed to bury or pack out, the smell you expect. I finished fast and turned to go back. My headlamp caught something tied to a branch, a strip of red cloth. I thought it was flagging tape at first, but when I got close, I saw it was part of a bandana. Kellen wore a red bandana around his neck when he portaged so the canoe yoke wouldn't rub. He'd had it that morning. I'd watched him wring sweat out of it. This strip was wet. I didn't touch it. Back at camp, Kellen had the bandana around his neck, not torn, whole. I stood there staring at him longer than I should have. He asked what my problem was, and I told them. Mira wanted to see it. Soren shook his head once and said no. We didn't go back. That night, we made rules. No one went anywhere alone. No one answered a voice unless they could see the person's face and hands. No one talked near the water unless absolutely necessary. No one followed lights. No one followed canoes. If something called from the woods, we stayed put. If something called from the water, we stayed put. If one of us got separated, we met at the last confirmed portage landing, not wherever the voice said to go. We were scared, but making rules helped. It turned panic into a checklist. Around 3 a.m, the aluminum canoe came back. I didn't see it arrive. I woke because Soren was outside the tents making a sound like shh through his teeth. I unzipped slowly. Mira was already awake behind me. Soren stood near the fire grate in his base layer, holding a paddle like a spear. Below our campsite, on the black water, the aluminum canoe floated just offshore. This time it was close enough to see better. Nobody sat in it. That was somehow worse than seeing figures. It rocked gently even though the water was still. Something pale lay across the middle again, under the thwarts. It looked like a deer hide at first. Then it shifted. Kellen crawled out of the other tent, hair sticking up, face slack with sleep. He whispered, asking what it was. The pale thing in the canoe lifted one end. Not a head exactly, not enough to see features. Just a wet, pale rise, like a face under thin cloth turning toward us. Then Kellen's voice came from the canoe. "What is that?" Kellen made a sound in his throat and clapped both hands over his mouth. The canoe drifted closer. Soren stepped forward and slapped his paddle flat against a tree trunk. The crack was huge in the quiet. I flinched so hard my neck hurt. The canoe stopped. Soren did it again. Crack. The canoe began to turn, not drift, turn. Bow swinging away from us against no current I could see. Then it slid backward into the dark. We stayed up until dawn. Nobody said much. Kellen kept his mouth covered with the sleeve of his fleece like he was afraid his own voice would get loose. In daylight, the lake looked normal. Cold, blue-gray, pine-covered, indifferent. I hated it more that way. At least at night it admitted what it was. We decided to leave, not continue the loop, not salvage the trip. Leave. Mira studied the map and chose what she thought was the fastest way out that didn't involve backtracking past the aluminum canoe campsite. We would paddle south and east, take a chain through smaller lakes, then work back toward Moose River north. It wasn't our original plan, but it was doable. Long day, maybe very long, but doable if we moved. The problem was Kellen. He didn't want to paddle in the stern anymore because it meant facing forward, while I sometimes faced backward, and he said he couldn't stand not knowing what was behind him. Mira told him that wasn't how canoes worked. He told her he didn't care. They snapped at each other until Soren picked up Kellen's pack and carried it to the landing. That ended the argument. The first half of the day went almost normal. Almost. We paddled hard. The sky cleared a little. Sun touched the tops of the pines for maybe 20 minutes, and I remember feeling embarrassed by how relieved I was. The shoreline looked real again. Rocks, lichen, jack pine, water. At a portage into a small, unnamed-looking lake on my map, we met two men coming the other direction. They were real. I know they were real because one of them had a bright orange dry bag and a fishing rod with a broken tip, and he was annoyed in a very normal human way about the mud. His friend wore a Viking's hat and asked if the wind was bad on Oyster. Mira answered before any of us could stop her, saying it wasn't too bad. Soren's eyes went to the water beside the landing. Nothing happened. The men told us there was an open site on the next lake if we needed it, then kept going. Their boots squelched. Their canoe banged a tree. One of them swore. I almost cried from how ordinary they were. We didn't tell them anything. I've asked myself why 100 times. The easy answer is that we didn't want to sound insane. The real answer is that seeing them made us hope we weren't. Maybe we'd scared ourselves. Maybe the canoe had been some night fisherman. Maybe the voices were echoes across water. Maybe. Then we reached the next landing and found a paddle stuck blade down in the mud. It was Kellen's. Same black shaft, same yellow tape around the grip because he'd complained about blisters. He was holding his actual paddle at that exact moment. We all looked at the paddle in the mud, then at the paddle in Kellen's hands. On the yellow tape, someone had written Kellen in black marker. He'd done that himself before the trip. All our rental paddles had names on tape because the outfitter told us groups mixed them up constantly. Mira stepped closer, and Soren grabbed the back of her life jacket and pulled her away. The paddle trembled once, then it sank straight down. Not fell, not tipped, sank. The grip disappeared into mud. The shaft followed. In 3 seconds, the whole thing was gone, like something underneath had pulled it. Kellen backed away from the landing and vomited into the leaves. After that, none of us pretended. We moved faster, but not smarter. Fear made us sloppy. We banged the canoes on rocks. We left one of the sponge balers at a landing. I spilled half a bag of trail mix trying to eat while walking. Mira twisted her ankle on a root and kept going without saying anything until I noticed her limping. Soren navigated. Not officially. It just happened. Mira still had the map, but Soren started pointing before she asked. Left bay, second landing. Stay close to shore. Wait. He wasn't bossy. He barely spoke. He just became the only person who seemed able to feel the shape of the place without letting it get into his head. Around late afternoon, we hit the portage where Kellen disappeared. It was not an interesting portage. That's what I remember most. No dramatic cliff, no swamp, no weird rock formation. Just a muddy landing, a narrow trail through spruce and birch, and another lake on the other side. According to the map, it was under 100 rods. We were tired but relieved. Short portages had become little promises. Mira and Soren went first with one canoe and 2 packs. Kellen and I stayed at the landing with the second canoe and the remaining gear. The water behind us was calm, too calm. I kept watching it while Kellen adjusted the yoke pads. He was sweating even though it was cold. He whispered that he hated how it had his voice. I told him not to talk near the water. He said he wasn't near the water, but he was. We both were. The landing was only a few feet wide. The trees across the lake gave back a faint mumble of his words, not an echo exactly, more like someone on the other shore had repeated him into cupped hands. I saw Kellen hear it. His face changed. I told him not to do anything. Then he looked behind me. At the far end of the portage trail, just visible between trunks, Mira stood with one hand raised. She was too far away for detail, but it looked like her blue rain shell. She waved us on. Kellen said to come on and lifted the front of the canoe. I hesitated because something felt wrong, but everything felt wrong by then. I couldn't separate useful fear from background fear. Kellen snapped at me to pick it up, so I did. We got the canoe onto our shoulders and started down the trail. Kellen was in front, bent under the bow, feet quick and uneven. I was under the stern, watching roots pass below me through the tunnel of canoe and trees. The trail seemed longer than it should have. I know everybody says that in stories like this. I know tired people misjudge distance. 100 rods can feel like forever with a canoe on your shoulders. But this wasn't just long, it was repetitive. Same birch with a black scar. Same mossy boulder on the right. Same step down into mud. Same broken branch across the trail at chest height. The first time, I ducked under it. The second time, I thought, that's weird. The third time, I said Kellen's name. He didn't stop. I said it again, louder. He kept walking. His end of the canoe dipped and swayed like he was going downhill, but the trail was flat. I told him to stop. He stopped so suddenly the stern slid forward and hit the back of my head. I ducked out from under the yoke, cursing, and turned around. The landing behind us was gone. Not hidden by a bend. Gone. The trail behind us stretched straight through trees farther than it should have, dim and wet and empty. Ahead, Kellen stood under the bow, facing away from me. The canoe blocked part of him, but I could see his legs. He was shaking. Then Mira called from ahead, telling us to hurry up. Kellen made a sobbing sound. From behind us, Mira called again. I dropped my end of the canoe. It hit the ground hard. Kellen stumbled, the bow thumping down beside him. He turned, and I saw tears on his face. Not dramatic crying, just tears spilling out while his mouth hung open. He asked which way. I didn't know. The Mira ahead called, "This way." The Mira behind called, "Where are you?" Then Soren's voice came from the left side of the trail, maybe 20 feet into the trees, telling us not to answer. Kellen bolted. Not down the trail, not back. He ran right, straight into the woods. I yelled his name before I could stop myself. Branches snapped. His orange pack cover flashed between spruce trunks, then vanished. For maybe 3 seconds, I could hear him crashing through brush. Then nothing. The woods swallowed him completely. I stood there with the canoe at my feet, breathing so hard I felt like I might pass out. I yelled his name again. This time his voice answered from behind me, close enough that I spun around expecting him to be right there. Nothing stood on the trail. Then his voice came from ahead, then from the right where he'd run, then from somewhere high above, not loud but clear, like someone leaning down from the branches. I grabbed the bowline of the canoe and started dragging it. I don't even know which way I chose. Away from the voices, that's all. I dragged until the yoke caught on a root, lifted it, dragged again, slipped in mud, got up, kept going. My shoulder clipped trees. The canoe scraped and banged and made enough noise to wake the whole forest. Nobody came. No Mira, no Soren, no Kellen. Then I heard water. I followed it. The trail came back under my feet like it had been there all along. 10 steps later, I stumbled out at the far landing. Mira and Soren were standing there. The first canoe was already loaded in the water. The packs they'd carried were piled beside it. They stared at me, then at the canoe dragging behind me. Mira asked where Kellen was. I shook my head. She asked again, louder, and I told them what happened. Not well. I was gasping and pointing, and saying the same pieces over and over. Mira tried to push past me toward the trail. Soren stopped her. She told him we had to get Kellen. Soren didn't say no. He just looked at the trail. From the other end of the portage, faint but clear, Kellen screamed. It was real. I still believe the first scream was real. It ripped through the trees, raw and human and terrified. Mira shoved Soren away and ran. I went after her because of course I did. Soren came too. We made it maybe 30 yards before Kellen screamed again, this time from the lake behind us. Then again from the lake ahead, then from both at once. Mira stopped so fast I almost hit her. Kellen's voice sobbed from somewhere to our right, saying he was stuck. From our left, same voice. From behind us. From ahead. All around us, Kellen begged. Mira doubled over and pressed her fists against her ears. Soren grabbed my sleeve and pulled me close enough that his mouth was almost touching my head. He said, "Back to water." That went against every rule we'd made, but I understood. In the trees, it had us. At least at the landing we could see. We got Mira moving. She kept saying Kellen's name under her breath, which scared me almost as much as the voices. I wanted to cover her mouth. I didn't. At the landing, we stood in a tight little group facing the trail. The voices stopped. The silence after was worse. We waited there for 20 minutes, maybe longer. Time got loose. No Kellen came out. Mira tried to call for him once. Soren put a hand on her shoulder, not rough, but firm. She slapped it away, and then started crying because she knew he was right. We had a satellite messenger in Mira's pack. One of those little emergency devices you can use to send preset messages or an emergency signal. We hadn't touched it because this wasn't a broken leg or a capsized canoe. It felt too strange for the button. That sounds insane now, but in the moment, hitting emergency made the whole thing real in a way none of us wanted. Mira hit it. The device blinked. We waited for confirmation. Nothing. She moved to a clearer spot by the landing and held it up. Still nothing. The tree cover wasn't even that thick there. It should have worked eventually. The screen showed it trying. Then it shut off. Battery dead. Mira stared at it and said she had charged it. Nobody accused her of not charging it. We'd all seen it plugged in at the bunkhouse in Ely. She'd turned it on that morning and it had shown nearly full. Soren held out his hand. She gave it to him. He tried to power it back on. Nothing. We had phones, all useless. We had a paper map, compasses, food, and canoes. We did not have Kellen. I wish I could tell you we searched properly. I wish I could tell you we made a grid, marked our positions, stayed calm. We did some of that. We went back onto the portage together, 10 steps at a time, calling only once every few minutes, even though calling felt dangerous. We found the place where the canoe had dropped. We found Kellen's hat in the mud. We found broken brush where he'd run right. We followed it maybe 30 feet. Then it stopped. No footprints, no broken branches, no orange pack cover. The ground was soft enough that there should have been something. There wasn't. After an hour, Soren said we needed to leave the landing before dark. Mira said no. Soren didn't argue. He just started unloading one canoe enough to make room for 3. I hated him for that for maybe 10 seconds. Then I hated myself because I knew he was right. We left markers, real ones, bright pieces of pack towel tied to branches at the landing and where Kellen had run off. Mira wrote on a page torn from her notebook, "Kellen, stay here. We are getting help." Entry point 16. She put it in a zip bag with a granola bar and tied it to a branch. Then we paddled. Mira sat in the middle of one canoe, hunched over the dead satellite messenger, trying it every few minutes. Soren sterned. I paddled bow. The second canoe was tied behind us on a short line, bouncing and scraping when we turned wrong. We did not speak, not because of the rule anymore, because there was nothing to say. That evening we reached a campsite the 2 men had probably mentioned earlier, though I couldn't be sure. It had a flat rock landing and a decent tent pad. There was chopped wood under a cedar root. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a great sight. We hated it. The 3 of us set one tent. Nobody wanted to split up. We kept the canoes pulled high into camp and tied them to a tree. Soren wedged paddles under the canoe seats like that would matter. Mira didn't eat. She sat on a log with the map open in her lap, staring at the same spot. I tried to get a fire going and failed twice because my hands were shaking. Soren took over and got it burning with birch bark in one match. I remember being angry at how calm he looked. When the flames caught, Mira finally said, "We left him." Soren said, "We left a place for him to wait." "That's the same thing," she said. He said it wasn't, and then didn't say anything else. She looked at me. I didn't know what she wanted. Agreement, denial, permission to hate us. I had nothing to give her. Around full dark, we heard a canoe bump the landing. Not ours. Ours were tied near the fire. A soft knock came from below, wood on rock. Then Kellen said, "Guys?" Mira stood. Soren stood too. Kellen's voice came again from the landing, saying he'd found the lake and followed our markers. Mira made a sound like she'd been punched. I grabbed her arm. She tried to pull away. I held on. Kellen coughed below us and said he was freezing. It did sound like him, not the flat copying from earlier. Him, tired, scared, pissed off. Soren picked up a burning stick from the fire and walked to the edge of camp where the rocks sloped toward the water. I stayed beside Mira, holding her arm with both hands now. The landing was maybe 20 feet below, visible through thin brush and firelight. A canoe floated there, the aluminum one. Kellen sat in the bow, or something shaped like Kellen did. It wore his orange pack, his red bandana, his gray fleece. Its head was down, wet hair hanging over its forehead. No one sat in the stern. Soren held the burning stick high. Mira called Kellen's name before I could stop her. The head lifted. I'll never forget the relief I felt in that first half second. It was his face. Muddy, pale, scratched, but his. I saw the crooked front tooth he'd chipped in college. I saw the little scar by his eyebrow. Then he smiled. Kellen smiled all the time. Smirked, grinned, laughed with his whole face. This wasn't that. This was a mouth remembering the shape. He asked us to help him. Soren didn't move. The thing in the canoe looked at him and said, "Ren, don't be weird. I'm cold." That was when I knew. Kellen never called him Ren. Nobody did. Soren hated having his name shortened, and Kellen thought it was funnier to call him by his full name in fake serious tones. Soren Michael usually. Mira knew too. I felt her stop pulling against my grip. Soren lowered the burning stick a little and asked what he'd told Kellen on the portage before he ran. The thing blinked. Its eyes moved from Soren to me to Mira. It smiled wider and said, "You said not to answer." Soren had said that, yes, but not to Kellen. He'd said it from the woods, or something had. Soren stepped back. The thing watched him. Then its face changed. Not melted, not shifted like in a movie. It just stopped performing for a second. The eyes went empty, and the smile stayed too long. Under the wet hair, the skin looked loose, like Kellen's face was a wet paper mask stuck over something narrower. Mira gagged. The thing said in her voice, "We left him." Then in mine, "We left him." Then in Kellen's, "You left me." The aluminum canoe scraped against the rock. The thing stood, too tall, not by a foot. Just enough that Kellen's clothes pulled wrong. His sleeves rode up his arms. His pant cuffs showed pale ankles. His shoulders seemed narrow and high, like the joints were hanging from the wrong place. Soren threw the burning stick. It landed in the canoe, sparks bursting across the wet bottom. The thing folded down after it. Folded is the only word I have. It didn't crouch. It collapsed at the hips and shoulders in a way that made Mira scream. One hand slapped the side of the canoe, fingers long and white against the aluminum. The canoe pushed backward from shore. The thing never paddled. It drifted away with the burning stick hissing out between its feet. We packed in the dark. That sounds simple. It wasn't. It was chaos. We shoved wet gear into packs. We left one tent stake, a fuel canister, Kellen's fishing rod, the tarp line, and probably half our dignity. Mira kept making small broken sounds but didn't argue. Soren moved like a machine. We launched with one canoe and towed the other again because none of us wanted to split up. Soren sterned. I bowed. Mira sat in the middle with a headlamp pointed down at the map, even though none of us wanted light on our faces. We paddled along the shore, not across open water. It was slower, but the thought of being in the middle of the lake under that sky made my throat close. The stars had come out. I remember that clearly because they were beautiful, and that felt cruel. The Milky Way was smeared over the black treetops. The water reflected pieces of it between paddle strokes. Somewhere far off, a loon called. Then another loon answered in Kellen's voice. Mira whispered no. The sound came again, half loon, half person, not words, just Kellen's tone stretched into that lonely rising call. Soren kept paddling. We missed the first portage in the dark. Or it wasn't where the map said. Or we were on the wrong bay. I still don't know. We reached a muddy indentation that looked like a landing, got halfway unloaded, and then Soren found a fire grate 10 feet into the woods. Not a campsite, just a fire grate, standing alone among trees. No tent pad, no latrine trail, no cleared area, just a metal grate on bare dirt, cold and black, with stones around it like someone had built a fake campsite and forgotten the rest. Mira backed toward the canoe. On the far side of the grate, someone had arranged 3 paddles upright against a tree. One had yellow tape around the handle. Kellen. We got back on the water. Nobody needed to say it. The next landing we found was real, I think. There was a worn path in the right angle of shoreline, and the portage headed where it should. We carried only what we needed for one trip, and left the second canoe tied at the landing while we moved the first and the main packs. It was maybe the worst walk of my life. Not because anything happened, because nothing did. Every crack under my boot sounded like a hand reaching. Every black space between tree trunks looked occupied. Mira walked between me and Soren and held the back of my jacket like a kid. At the far landing, we put the canoe down and waited. The lake ahead was a black oval under the stars. From the trail behind us came the sound of someone carrying a canoe. Normal sounds. Hull-knocking bark. Feet in mud. Breath under weight. For one insane second, I thought Kellen had found the second canoe and was bringing it across. Then the sound stopped. Kellen's voice said, "Little help?" He sounded irritated. Normal. So normal I almost answered. Soren put one finger to his lips. The voice sighed and complained that the canoe was killing his shoulders. Mira shook with silent crying. The canoe sound resumed. Slow steps. Closer. There was no way to hide at the landing. No way to get on the water without making noise. We stood beside our canoe while something came down the portage carrying the other one. A pale shape appeared between trees. At first, I saw only the bottom of the canoe above brush, a long dark curve moving toward us. Under it, legs. Too many legs. I blinked, and there were 2. Then 4 again. Then 2. My brain refused to hold the image still. The canoe tilted as it passed between 2 birches, and I saw fingers curled around the gunnels from underneath. Long fingers, white knuckles, more than one set. Kellen's voice, strained under the weight, asked for help again. Soren stepped backward into the water. Mira followed. I grabbed the bowline of our canoe. The thing under the other canoe stopped at the edge of the trees. It lowered the canoe slowly. Only the bow touched the ground. The stern stayed up, held by something hidden in the dark. Then Kellen's face appeared under the bow, upside down. It hung there, smiling from the shadow beneath the canoe. Mira screamed. Not a full scream. Soren slapped his hand over her mouth and pulled her into the canoe so hard she fell. I shoved off. The canoe scraped rock. I jumped in too late and got one boot full of water. Soren pushed us out with his paddle, then leapt in at the stern. Behind us, the other canoe dropped flat on the landing. The bang echoed across the lake. Then every shoreline answered in our voices. Mira screaming, me shouting. Soren's rare, sharp go, Kellen laughing. All of it came back at us in pieces from every direction, layered and wrong, like the lake had recorded us and couldn't decide which part to play first. Soren paddled harder than I thought a person could paddle. I followed his rhythm because it was the only thing I had. Dip, pull, lift, dip, pull, lift. Mira lay flat in the bottom between us, one hand clamped over her own mouth. We crossed that lake in the dark without talking. I don't know how we didn't hit a rock. I don't know how we found the next landing. Soren did. He pointed with his paddle, and there it was, a gap in the trees exactly wide enough for the canoe. We didn't carry the canoe over that portage, we dragged it. Sorry to everyone who cares about leave no trace. I mean that. But we dragged that rented Kevlar canoe over roots, mud, rocks, everything. We were past strength, past skill, past caring. By the time we reached the next water, the bottom was scratched to hell and my arms felt detached from my body. Dawn came in pieces. First the sky softened, then the trees became trees instead of black cutouts. Then mist rose off the water and turned the lake into something half erased. We were somewhere south of where we meant to be. Mira figured that out by the shape of the shoreline when there was enough light to see. She didn't panic. She just stared at the map, turned it once, then turned it back and said we weren't on the lake we should have been on. Soren leaned over. She pointed to where we should have been. He looked at the shoreline, then at the compass, and said no. I asked what that meant. Mira rubbed both eyes with the heels of her hands and said it meant we had either taken the wrong portage in the dark, or the map was useless, or she was useless. I told her she wasn't useless. She laughed once, and it sounded awful. Soren tapped the compass and said, "East." Mira looked at him. He pointed again. "We go east until something matches." That became the plan. We paddled east. The lake narrowed into a creek choked with grass. Twice we had to get out and pull the canoe through muck. My wet boot made obscene squishing sounds every step. Mira's ankle had swollen badly. Soren gave her one of his trekking poles, though I hadn't even realized he'd packed one. Nobody spoke unless we had to. By mid-morning we found a portage sign, a real one. Wooden post, worn letters, nailed arrow. I could have kissed it. The lake name matched Mira's map. I'm not going to name every lake after that because I know some of this already sounds like nonsense, and I don't want anyone trying to retrace our exact route like this is a puzzle. It's not. Also, I'm not fully sure where all of it happened anymore. I know the big points: Moose River North, Nina Moose, Agnes, Oyster. After Kellen disappeared, the map and the actual ground stopped agreeing in my memory. The sign gave us something solid. We ate there. Peanut butter on tortillas, cold instant coffee powder mixed badly in lake water, and a handful of gummy bears Soren had been saving. Mira kept trying the satellite messenger. Still dead. Her phone had 3% battery. No service. Mine had 11%. Kellen's was gone with Kellen. Soren's was off to save battery, which made me want to kiss him because I had not thought that far ahead. We rested for 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, a red canoe came across the lake. Not aluminum, not ghostly. A normal red canoe with 2 people in it, paddling badly but happily. A woman in front, man in back, both wearing baseball caps. They had a dog between them, a black lab with gray around its muzzle. The dog saw us before they did. It stood in the canoe, stiff, staring at our landing. The woman turned and waved. The man steered toward us and asked if we were okay. I started to answer, but Soren grabbed my shoulder. The woman's smile faded. She asked again. The dog began to whine. Mira took 1 step forward and said we'd lost our friend. The couple looked at each other. Mira said our friend had disappeared yesterday on a portage west of Oyster, and that we needed help. They came in fast after that. The dog did not want to land. It backed up, nails clicking on the canoe bottom, whining higher and higher until the woman had to hold its collar. That dog looked into the woods behind us like it saw the end of the world standing there. The couple were named Orla and Bennett. I only remember because their names were written on their canoe in black marker. They were probably in their 60s, experienced enough that their packs were small and their paddles were nice. They listened while Mira explained the normal version. Friends separated on portage. Couldn't find him. Emergency device failed. Trying to exit for help. She did not mention voices. She did not mention the aluminum canoe. She did not mention Kellen coming back wrong. Bennett looked serious but not skeptical. People do get lost up there. People do have emergencies. He had a satellite messenger. He turned it on. Full battery, no signal. He frowned, stepped down to the very edge of the landing, and held it high. The dog growled. The screen blinked. Then it went black. Bennett stared at it. Orla said his name. He pressed the power button. Nothing. I watched something pass across his face, the exact moment our story became something else for him. Soren said, "Don't talk near the water." Bennett looked at him. Soren didn't explain. From across the lake, Bennett's voice called back, "Don't talk near the water." The black lab lunged so hard Orla almost fell. Bennett backed away from shore. The couple didn't come with us. I don't blame them. They had their own route, their dog, and probably a strong instinct not to join 3 terrified strangers in a broken story. But they did the decent thing. They gave us a spare emergency blanket, a battery bank, and their paper map for the section east of where we were. Bennett also gave Soren a little orange whistle, started to explain 3 blasts, then stopped himself and glanced at the lake. Orla looked at Mira and told her there was a ranger cabin down toward Lac La Croix. Not close, but there might be people. Mira shook her head and said we were going out. Orla nodded and said, "Then go out. Don't stop unless you have to." The dog never stopped growling until their canoe was 20 yards from shore. We watched them paddle away. Before they rounded the point, Orla looked back once. Her face had gone hard. She raised one hand, not waving exactly, more like goodbye. Then they were gone. The battery bank brought Mira's phone back to 14%, but still no service. Soren turned his on for the first time since things got bad. He had 68% because of course he did, and he still clipped the battery bank to it while it booted, because none of us trusted anything with a screen anymore. No service there either, but he had offline maps downloaded. The location dot spun for a long time, then placed us near where Mira thought we were. For the first time since Kellen vanished, the map agreed with the world. We moved. The rest of that day became a grind. Paddle, portage, paddle, portage. Eat while walking. Drink when you remember. Don't look too long at any one spot in the trees. The woods changed moods by the hour. Sometimes they felt empty. Sometimes they felt crowded. Sometimes I was sure something walked parallel to us just beyond sight, matching our pace. Twice I saw movement on shore and refused to turn my head. Around noon, we heard chopping, axe on wood. 3 sharp hits, then a pause. 3 hits, pause. It came from somewhere ahead and left. Mira whispered that it might be campers. Soren shook his head. The chopping continued. It was too even. Same force each time. Same rhythm. Not someone splitting wood. Someone making a sound they knew people would recognize. We paddled past the bay it came from. At the back of it, a yellow tent stood on a flat rock. A man in a red jacket stood beside the fire grate with an axe. The same man from Agnes. The one with the coffee mug. He raised the axe slowly, brought it down against a log, and missed. The blade hit rock with a spark. He raised it again. His face was turned toward us. Too far to see clearly, but I knew he was smiling. Kellen's voice came from the yellow tent, calling for us. We paddled harder. Mira started whispering numbers under her breath. At first I thought she was praying. Then I realized she was counting strokes. By late afternoon her lips had gone pale. Her ankle was bad. We split her pack between mine and Soren's. She got angry about it but didn't have the energy to fight. The sky darkened before it should have. Clouds came from the west, low and heavy. Wind pushed against us on a narrow lake, turning small waves white. We had to cross diagonally to reach the next portage. Halfway across, the towed canoe line snapped. The empty canoe drifted away. I saw the rope go slack and yelled without thinking. Soren turned us hard. Mira grabbed for the line and missed. The loose canoe swung sideways in the wind, 20 feet away, then 30. Mira said we needed it, and she was right. One canoe could carry 3 people barely, but not comfortably, with all the packs. The second canoe was safety, speed, gear space, stability. It drifted toward the far shore. Then it stopped. The wind still pushed waves around it, but the canoe stopped moving. Its bow dipped once. Something pale rose behind it, only for a second. A head, or a shoulder, or a hand on the stern. Then the canoe turned around and began drifting back toward us, against the wind. Nobody moved. It came closer. 10 feet, 8, 5. The loose bowline trailed in the water like a dead snake. Soren whispered not to touch it. The canoe bumped ours. Inside the empty canoe, lying neatly across the bottom, was Kellen's red bandana. Whole, dry. Mira made a sound and reached for it. I slapped her hand away. She looked at me like she hated me. Then the bandana moved, not blown by wind, not sliding with water. It twisted, bunching in the middle like something underneath it had flexed. Soren cut the tow line with his knife. The empty canoe drifted back fast, too fast. It slid away from us into the rough water, turned broadside, and flipped without a splash. 1 second it was there. The next the lake was empty. No floating hull, no rope, no bandana, just waves. We made shore in the one canoe. I don't remember that crossing clearly. I remember my arms screaming. I remember Mira vomiting over the side, and then apologizing. I remember Soren saying left once, sharp, because I was paddling us toward a rock. At the landing, we sat in the mud and shook. The rain started then, cold, slanted, steady. We had maybe 2 hours of light left, maybe less with the storm. Mira said there was a campsite on the far side of the next lake. Soren checked the map and pointed at another portage after that. No camp, he said. Mira stared at him. He pointed again. Out. She said we couldn't get out that night. He looked at the rain, then the lake, then the trees, and said we could get closer. That was Soren's whole strategy. Get closer. To what? It almost didn't matter. Closer to roads, closer to people, closer to anything that wasn't there. We took the portage. Halfway across, we found the latrine. Not a latrine trail. Not near a campsite. Just a wilderness latrine sitting beside the portage trail, facing us. A brown fiberglass box with the lid down. Mira stopped walking and said it wasn't supposed to be there. Soren didn't slow. He told her to keep moving. As we passed it, the lid lifted just an inch. From inside, Kellen whispered, "I'm sorry." Mira stumbled. I grabbed her pack strap and hauled her forward. The lid dropped shut behind us. At the next lake, the wind had fallen. The water was flat and gray under rain. Mist hung low, turning the far shore into smudges. We paddled close to the right bank because Soren wanted landmarks. That was when we followed the wrong canoe. It came out of the mist ahead of us, maybe 100 yards away. A green canoe this time, not aluminum, not ours. 2 paddlers, one in front and one in back. Both wearing rain jackets with hoods up, normal. They moved at a steady pace along the shoreline. Mira saw them first and whispered that they were people. We all watched. The canoe angled toward a narrow gap between 2 points. Soren checked the map. There should have been a portage there. Short carry into a lake that would put us closer to the Moose River drainage. It was exactly what we needed. The green canoe reached the gap and disappeared. No voices, no weird movement, no pale thing in the middle, just a normal canoe taking the portage. We followed. That's the part I keep coming back to. We followed. Even after everything. Even after making rules. Even after telling ourselves not to trust anything on the water. We were cold, exhausted, missing a friend, down one canoe, and desperate to see people. The green canoe looked like rescue, or at least confirmation that the map was right. At the gap, there was a landing. Good landing. Worn mud, scraped rocks, a little open space to unload. We got out. No green canoe, no paddlers. That didn't alarm us immediately because they'd have already started the portage. The trail rose through cedar. Soren went first with the canoe. I took the big pack. Mira followed with the smaller pack and paddles. At the top of the first rise, I looked back. The lake below was gone. Not hidden, gone. There was no water where we had landed, just trees and fog. The air behind us had gone colder and strangely flat, like sound had been packed in wet wool. Even the smell had changed. No lake smell, no mud, no rain on open water. Just cedar rot, and that thick white fog pressing between the trunks. I almost dropped the pack. Soren stopped when I said his name. Mira turned around and saw it too. Behind us, the trail went down into mist where the shoreline should have been. No shine of water, no rocks, no canoe landing. Just woods that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. From ahead, paddles knocked together. The green canoe people were somewhere up the trail. I could hear them walking. 2 sets of steps, canoe creaking, a pack buckle clicking. Then one of them coughed. A normal cough. Mira whispered that we should keep going. I wanted to say no. I wanted to turn back, even though back had stopped existing. I wanted to sit down and wait for daylight, even though daylight hadn't helped much. Soren lifted the canoe again. We kept going. The portage was wrong. The ground changed under us from mud to pine needles to bare rock to ankle-deep moss. The trail widened, then narrowed, then widened again. Once it passed between 2 boulders so close the canoe scraped both sides. Another time it crossed a little stream that wasn't on the map. The water in the stream was perfectly still, though it ran downhill. Ahead, the green canoe remained just out of sight. We heard it constantly. A foot slip, a branch snap, the hollow bump of hull against tree. They never got farther away, never got closer. At some point, Mira started whispering no every few steps, not loud, almost under her breath. Soren stopped so suddenly I ran into the back of the canoe. On the trail ahead, a paddle lay across the path. Green blade, wooden shaft, old. Beside it was a pile of wet clothes. 2 rain jackets, 2 pairs of pants, 2 hats. No people. The clothes were arranged like someone had stepped out of them and kept walking. The green canoe sounds continued ahead. Mira began to cry again, but quietly. Everything was quiet by then. Even the rain had softened into mist. Soren backed up, not turning around. Just backing, canoe still on his shoulders. I backed too. Mira whispered that the lake was gone. Soren said, "Then find it." It was the most he'd said all day, and somehow it broke the spell a little. We turned and ran as much as you can run on a portage with a canoe and packs. The trail behind us was not the same trail. I knew it instantly. Different rocks, different trees, no stream, no boulders. The fog had rearranged everything behind us, like the portage had folded over on itself while our backs were turned. But it sloped down, and down meant water, so we followed. Branches slapped my face, my boots slid out from under me. Mira fell once and got up without a word. Soren had the canoe bouncing off trees so hard I thought it would crack. The fog brightened ahead. Water appeared. We burst out at a landing, not the same landing. Our canoe was not there because Soren was carrying it. That sounds obvious, but in the moment I looked for it tied at shore and nearly lost my mind when I didn't see it. The lake in front of us was narrow, more like a river. Current moved left to right. Real current. Real water. Soren dumped the canoe into it. We got in. No one checked the map. We let the current take us. For maybe 10 minutes, we floated through a channel between thick reeds and leaning spruce. The rain stopped. The sky turned the color of dirty cotton. I could smell mud and cedar and my own sour clothes. Then the channel opened into a lake. On the far shore was a campsite with smoke rising from the fire grate. Real smoke. Not mist, not a light. Smoke. There were 3 people standing near the fire. One wore an orange hat. One had a blue tarp draped over their shoulders. The third was splitting wood. Soren backpaddled before I said anything. Mira stared and whispered, "Campers." The person in the orange hat waved both arms and yelled to us. Normal voice. The wood-splitting person turned. It was the man in the red jacket, the one from Agnes, the one from the fake camp. The orange hat person lowered his arms. Then all 3 opened their mouths and spoke in Kellen's voice. "You found us." Soren spun the canoe so hard we nearly tipped. We paddled back into the channel against current. I don't know how. Fear did it. Hate did it. Whatever was left in us did it. The voices followed along the banks, not crashing through brush, not moving physically, just appearing from places as we passed. Kellen from the reeds, Mira from under a leaning cedar, my own voice from a deadfall saying my full name. Soren's voice only once. It came from directly under the canoe. "Stop!" Soren froze for half a stroke. I saw it hit him. His own voice. He'd been safe, or we thought he had, because he barely talked, but it had enough now. One word, maybe copied from earlier, maybe stolen some other way. Mira grabbed his sleeve. He started paddling again. We reached the landing where we'd entered the channel, except now there was a yellow portage sign nailed to a tree. The letters were carved deep. Moose River North, that was impossible. We were not there. We couldn't be. We were miles from the entry point, turned around, exhausted, nowhere close. But the sign pointed up the trail. Mira laughed, a tiny hysterical sound. Soren stared at the sign for maybe 2 seconds. Then he shook his head and said no, we did not take that portage. Instead, Soren pushed us away from shore and angled the canoe along the lake edge. We paddled through reeds so thick they scratched the hull. Twice we had to shove off submerged logs. Once something bumped the bottom from below hard enough to lift the bow. We kept going. Near sunset we found a real campsite. I know I've said real too many times, but there were levels by then. This one had normal trash in the grate, fish foil, half-burned oatmeal packet, a cut log with axe marks that weren't in perfect patterns, a latrine trail where it should be. Human mess, human laziness, human proof. We had to stop. Mira couldn't walk. I couldn't feel 2 fingers on my left hand. Soren's face had gone gray with exhaustion. The canoe had a deep scrape along the bottom that worried me. We needed water filtered, dry socks if any existed, food, and 10 minutes without paddling. We made camp before full dark. 1 tent again. No fire this time because smoke would show where we were. Which is a stupid thought in a place where whatever followed us didn't need smoke. But fear makes its own rules. We ate energy bars inside the tent. 3 adults in 1 2-person tent, wet, filthy, shaking. Mira's ankle was purple. Soren wrapped it with a compression bandage. She bit her sleeve while he did it. No one spoke for a long time. Then Mira said the real Kellen might still be alive. Neither of us answered. Soren nodded once. That was enough for her to keep breathing. Later, something circled camp. Not footsteps, a canoe scrape. It went around us in a slow circle, though we were 30 yards from water. Scrape, pause, tap, scrape, pause, tap. Around and around the tent. At one point a paddle blade slid under the rainfly, just the tip. Black with yellow tape on the shaft. Kellen's paddle. It rested there beside the tent wall like an offering. Nobody moved. The paddle slid back out. Then Kellen whispered from inches away, "I'm not mad." Mira pressed her face into her sleeping bag. He whispered that he would have left us too. The voice moved to my side of the tent and asked me to tell them it was okay. I didn't. It went to Soren's side. In Soren's voice it said, "Tell them." Soren reached into his pack and took out the orange whistle Bennett had given him. He blew 3 blasts. Inside the tent, it was deafening. Outside, everything stopped. For 2 seconds. Then every direction answered with 3 whistle blasts. Near, far, from the lake, from the latrine, from above us, from beneath us. Hundreds of them overlapping, shrill and frantic, until it sounded like the whole forest was screaming for help. Soren put the whistle down. We lay there until the blasts faded one by one. In the morning the whistle was gone, so was the paddle. On the tent fly written in mud were 3 names, Mira, Soren, mine. Kellen's name was not there. We broke camp without eating. Soren took out his phone, still plugged into the battery bank, and got a location lock almost immediately. The dot placed us on a lake I recognized from Mira's map, not close to the exit, but not impossible. The fastest way to the entry point meant 2 lakes, a creek, 3 portages, then the Moose River if the map was right. If the map was right. We did not say that part. That last day was bright. I hated that too. Blue sky, crisp air, gold leaves on birch trees, all of it looking like a tourism brochure. If someone had paddled past us around noon, they'd have seen 3 dirty, tired people in a scratched canoe, and maybe thought we'd had a rough trip. They wouldn't have seen anything else. For hours, nothing happened. No voices, no canoes, no impossible signs. The quiet became suspicious, then hopeful, then suspicious again. We found the Moose River sometime after lunch. Mira cried when she saw it, not loud, just tears running down a dirty face. The river meant the exit was real. It meant direction. It meant there were only so many ways the day could go. We paddled south. The river was low in places. We dragged over beaver dams and around rocks. At one dam, I saw barefoot prints in fresh mud, but I didn't stop. At another, something moved in the grass beside us, keeping pace for 10 yards. I didn't look. Kellen called once from behind us, far back, not begging, not scared, just, "Guys." None of us turned. An hour later, he called from ahead, closer. "Wrong way." Soren kept paddling. We reached Nina Moose Lake in late afternoon. I'm sure of that because I recognized the open water and the campsite where we'd spent the first night. Seeing it gave me vertigo. It felt like years ago. The wind had picked up again, and we had to cross the lake to reach the river mouth. Not a huge crossing, but enough that it mattered. Waves hit the bow at an angle. I was in front, paddling on my knees because sitting made the canoe feel too unstable. Mira sat in the middle, bracing with one paddle across the gunnels. Soren sterned, correcting constantly. Halfway across, the aluminum canoe appeared to our left, not from behind an island, not from the shore. It was just there when I turned my head. Dull silver, dented side, empty except for the pale thing lying across the middle. It moved parallel to us. No paddlers, no sound. The waves didn't touch it right. Our canoe rose and fell. The aluminum one slid level, cutting through the chop like it was on rails. Mira saw it and made one small sound. Soren told us not to look. Of course, I kept looking. The pale thing lifted. This time I saw more. It wasn't a deer hide. It wasn't a person lying down. It was something folded into the canoe because it was too long for it. Limbs tucked wrong, spine arched, skin the color of wet birch bark, a head that seemed mostly mouth until it turned and became Kellen's face. Then Mira's, then mine, then Soren's, but unfinished, like it hadn't gotten enough practice. The eyes were in the wrong place. The mouth was too low. It smiled at me with Soren's almost face. Then it raised one long hand and pointed to the river mouth. A green canoe emerged from the reeds there, 2 hooded paddlers blocking the way. Soren swore. One word, the only time I heard him sound truly scared. The green canoe sat across the entrance like a gate. The aluminum canoe moved closer on our left. Behind us, from the open lake, Kellen called. "You can still come back," Mira said. "Go through them." Soren didn't answer. She said it again. I understood. Not around, not away, through. We pointed the canoe at the river mouth and paddled as hard as we could. The green canoe didn't move. As we got closer, I could see water streaming off the hooded figures, though it wasn't raining. Their paddles rested across their laps. The bow paddler lifted its head. Under the hood was nothing dark, not a shadow, nothing. A blank space where a face should be. I yelled. Not words, just noise. Mira yelled too. Soren yelled behind us, a harsh, raw sound. For once, we broke every rule at the same time. The lake threw our voices back in fragments, but we were already committed. At the last second, the green canoe turned broadside. Soren rammed it. The impact nearly launched me out of the bow. Wood cracked. Mira slammed into the front thwart. Our canoe rode up, tilted, and dropped hard. Freezing water poured over the side. I looked back expecting to see wreckage. There was no green canoe, no paddlers, only a line of bubbles across the water, like something huge had sunk straight down. The aluminum canoe was gone too. We shot into the river mouth. Current took us. Soren shouted, "Paddle!" We paddled. The Moose River south of Nina Moose became the longest stretch of water I have ever known. Every bend promised the next portage and delivered another bend. Every patch of grass looked like it hid someone crouching. The sun dropped behind trees and the cold came up from the water. At the first portage, we got out fast and carried everything in one ugly trip. Mira could barely walk. I had the pack and the bow handle. Soren took the stern and most of the weight. We were too tired to shoulder the canoe properly, so we half-carried it between us, at waist and chest height, stumbling forward with it like a battering ram we barely had control of. At the far end, a man stood at the landing. Not Kellen, a ranger or something dressed like one. Green pants, tan shirt under a jacket, ball cap, radio clipped to shoulder. He stood with his hands on his belt, looking annoyed. For a second, relief flooded me so hard I almost fell. Then Soren stopped. The ranger smiled and said we looked turned around. Normal voice, middle-aged, tired. Exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd found 3 idiots dragging a canoe through the woods. Mira started to speak. Soren stepped in front of her. The ranger said he was with the Forest Service, and that they'd gotten a report of a missing paddler. I should have felt relief. I didn't. The radio on his shoulder was dry. Everything else was wet. His boots, cuffs, jacket sleeves. But the radio was perfectly dry and clean, like a toy clipped there after the rest of the costume. Soren saw it too. The ranger said he needed us to split up so they could cover more ground. Mira's breathing changed. He smiled wider and said one of us should stay there while 2 came with him, because they had our friend just up the trail. Soren said nothing. The ranger's eyes moved to him and stayed there. He asked Soren if he was deaf. Soren still said nothing. I felt the air change. The thing didn't like him. Even after stealing his voice once, it didn't like that Soren wouldn't feed it more. The ranger looked at me and asked my name. I knew not to answer. I knew. But there's something about authority when you're exhausted. Something deep and trained. A ranger asks your name. You give it. My mouth opened. Mira drove her elbow into my ribs so hard I folded. The ranger's face went flat. Not angry. Empty. Then, from the woods behind him, Kellen screamed my name. My full name. The ranger turned his head toward the sound, annoyed, like a co-worker had interrupted him. Soren moved. He didn't attack the ranger. He didn't threaten him. He just lifted his end of the canoe higher and pushed toward the landing, forcing the ranger to either step aside or get hit. For 1 second, the ranger held his ground. Soren kept coming from the stern, driving the whole canoe forward, and I shoved the bow with him because stopping felt worse. The canoe's bow hit the ranger square in the chest. His chest dented inward, not like flesh, like wet cardboard. The ranger stepped aside. As we passed, I saw his face from 2 feet away. The skin around the mouth had tiny cracks in it, packed with mud. The eyes were too reflective. The lips moved without sound, practicing our names. We launched without looking back. Behind us, in Kellen's voice, the ranger said, "That was rude." We paddled. Another beaver dam, another drag, another bend. The light went orange, then dim. The last portage to the parking lot came near dark. I didn't recognize it at first. I'd been imagining it for 2 days as this magical threshold, a place where fear would drop away. Instead, it was just mud, rocks, and a worn path climbing into trees. But there was a wooden sign. Entry Point 16, Moose River North. I touched it when we landed. Real wood, real nails, old scratches, no trick. Mira started sobbing. Soren looked up the trail and said, "Move!" We carried the canoe between the 3 of us. No packs on backs, no proper form. Just get it out, get it to the lot, get to the car. Halfway up, someone walked behind us. We all heard it. One person. Slow, wet steps. We did not turn. The steps got closer. Mira whispered no. Soren told us to keep moving. The steps became 2 people, then 3, then the sound of a canoe being dragged. The parking lot appeared through the trees. I saw gravel, cars, the pit toilet roof, the dull shape of the empty canoe trailer, though the outfitter wasn't there yet because we weren't supposed to be out until the next day. My Subaru sat exactly where we'd left it. I have never loved anything the way I loved that dented gray car in that moment. Then Kellen stepped out from behind it. He was soaking wet. Orange pack, red bandana, gray fleece, mud on his face. He stood between us and the car with his arms hanging loose. Mira made a sound that was almost his name. Soren lowered his end of the canoe. I did too. For a long second, nobody moved. Kellen looked terrible. Scratched, pale, shivering. He had one shoe. His lips were blue. He looked real. I wanted him to be real so badly that it physically hurt. He took one step toward us and said, "Thank God." Mira covered her mouth. Kellen's eyes filled with tears. He said he thought we'd left him. That was the perfect thing to say. Not too much, not monster-like, not weird, just wounded and scared and angry in a way he had every right to be. He looked at Mira and said, "Miri." She flinched. He never called her Miri. He called her Mars because of some dumb bar trivia night years ago when he decided she looked like she could colonize planets. Never Miri. Soren picked up a rock from the edge of the lot. The thing wearing Kellen's face looked at him and said it was cold. Soren raised the rock. The thing smiled. Then, from somewhere behind us on the portage trail, the real Kellen screamed. The thing by the car stopped smiling. Its head turned toward the trail. That tiny reaction saved us, because whatever it was, it hadn't expected that either. Soren threw the rock at its face. It hit the thing in the cheek with a wet crack. The face dented. Mira ran for the car. I ran after her. Soren grabbed the canoe yoke and shoved it sideways into the thing's legs as he passed. It stumbled, not like a person losing balance, but like a puppet with tangled strings. Mira had the keys. She fumbled them once, dropped them, grabbed them, unlocked the doors. We piled in. Soren got in last and slammed the door so hard the whole car shook. The thing stood in front of us, one cheek caved in, Kellen's mouth hanging wrong. Behind it, the portage trail was dark. From that darkness, Kellen screamed again. Real or not, I don't know. I still don't know. Mira started the car. The thing put one long hand on the hood. For 1 second under the parking lot dusk, it stopped looking like Kellen. I saw pale skin pulled tight over bones that didn't match. I saw a mouth too wide, teeth small and flat like a person's, but arranged wrong. I saw eyes set back deep in a narrow face. I saw wet hair that wasn't hair but strands of something like lakeweed. Then the headlights came on fully. It was Kellen again, crying. Mira hit the gas. The car lurched forward. The thing rolled over the hood and slammed into the windshield. I saw Kellen's face spread across the glass, mouth open, eyes wide. Then it slid off the passenger side and vanished below the window. Mira didn't stop. She drove down the echo trail like a maniac, crying so hard she made little hiccup sounds. I kept looking back. Soren sat in the rear seat, turned around, watching through the back window. For the first mile, something ran behind us. Not on the road, in the trees. I saw flashes of pale between trunks, keeping pace with the car at 30 miles an hour, then 40. Then it dropped back. Then it was gone. We didn't stop until we had enough service to call 911. The dispatcher had trouble understanding us. I don't blame her. We were all talking at once except Soren, who took the phone from Mira and somehow made himself clear in short, brutal sentences. Missing person. Boundary waters. Moose River North. Male. Late 20s. Last seen near Portage west of Oyster Lake. 3 survivors at roadside on Echo Trail. Possible injury. Need rescue. He did not mention the thing. When the St. Louis County deputy found us, we were parked half on the shoulder with the heater blasting and all the dome lights on. Mira had wrapped herself in the emergency blanket Orla gave us. I was still wearing my life jacket. Soren stood outside the car because he said he needed to see the road. The deputy thought we were drunk at first. Then he saw Mira's ankle and our faces and called for more people. Search and rescue started that night as much as they could, then properly in the morning. We gave statements. We lied by omission. We said Kellen panicked and ran on a portage after we got turned around. We said we searched until dark. We said we thought we saw him near the entry parking lot, but couldn't confirm because we were exhausted and scared. That last part was close enough to true. They took us to Ely. At the ranger station, under fluorescent lights, with coffee going stale in a paper cup in my hands, the world began to reassemble itself. Radios worked. Phones charged. People wore uniforms and stayed people. The floor was ugly brown tile. Someone had a printer jam. I remember nearly laughing because a printer jam felt like proof of God. Around 6 in the morning, a Forest Service officer came in and asked to speak with us. Kellen had been found alive. 2 lakes back from where we said he disappeared, not near the entry point. A pair of campers had found him at dawn, curled under their overturned canoe on shore, hypothermic, barefoot, missing his pack, but alive. He was confused and dehydrated. He kept saying he'd followed our voices all night. He had no idea how he got there. Mira collapsed into a chair. I asked if we could see him. The officer said he'd been transported and we could meet him at the hospital after they stabilized him. Then he asked a question I still hear in my sleep. Which one of you drove out with him? Nobody answered. The officer looked from me to Mira to Soren and said Kellen claimed he'd watched our car leave the entry lot while someone with his face was standing in front of it. That was the moment the story stopped being something we could hide from each other. We saw Kellen later that day. The real Kellen. I knew as soon as we walked into the hospital room, not because of some magic test, because he looked like absolute hell in a normal way. Cracked lips, bruised shoulder, a hospital line in his arm, anger and fear and embarrassment all over his face. When Mira started crying, he said, "Don't do that, Mars." Mars. She almost fell on him, hugging him. He didn't remember everything. Or he said he didn't. He remembered hearing Mira from the woods, then me, then Soren. He remembered running because he thought he saw someone behind me on the trail, someone crawling under the canoe I was carrying. He remembered falling. He remembered water up to his waist in a place there shouldn't have been water. He remembered a canoe with no one in it bumping shore beside him. He did not remember getting to the lake where he was found. He had frostbite on 2 toes, cuts on his hands, and a long bruise across his ribs shaped almost like fingers. The search team found some of our gear. They found the second canoe too, not in the lake where it vanished, not near any portage we remembered. It was at the Moose River North parking lot, sitting upside down beside the sign, unscratched and dry. Inside it were 4 smooth stones. Nobody had an explanation for that. The outfitter charged us for the damaged canoe, and then quietly refunded it 2 weeks later. I don't know who he talked to. I don't know what he'd heard before from other people coming out of those woods. When I called to ask about some gear we'd left, he told me they found Kellen's fishing rod tied to the roof rack of my Subaru. We had driven home with it there. None of us put it there. I haven't been back to the Boundary Waters. Mira moved to Oregon and still hikes somehow. Not near lakes, though. Kellen doesn't camp anymore. He jokes about it sometimes, but it's not the same. Soren is the only one I still see regularly. We don't talk about the trip unless one of us has to. The last thing happened 3 months after. I got a padded envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a cheap memory card in a little plastic case. No note. I know I shouldn't have opened it. I did. There was one video file. It was shot from the stern of a canoe on a gray lake. Low angle, like the camera was sitting on the floor between someone's feet. Rain dotted the lens. The canoe moved without paddles. At first I thought it was empty. Then I saw the pale knees folded up on either side of the frame. The canoe drifted toward a campsite. Our first campsite on Nina Moose. The cedar wood was stacked under the same rock. Our 2 tents were set up. Smoke rose from the fire grate. The camera tilted. All 4 of us stood on shore. Me, Mira, Soren, Kellen. We were smiling, not waving, not talking, just smiling and waiting for the canoe to land. The video lasted 42 seconds. At the very end, from behind the camera, my voice whispered, "Don't talk near the water." Then Soren's voice answered perfectly clear, "I won't."